Marshal D. Teach, the remaining biological material of one Xebec, believes that he has the inherited will of his father and the right to take command of the world. However, in doing so, he has abandoned everything that Rock stood for and has become the complete inverse of that will. And everyone watching this video should be quite familiar with the concept of inherited will in One Piece, but a lesser known variant of that in-world force is the very real existence of uninherited will, which is the title of chapter 625. And as you can imagine, uninherited will is intentionally discarding what you have inherited from previous generations. In chapter 625, this concept was used by Queen Otohime, preventing the hatred of the current adult fishmen being inherited by the children that were about to witness the execution of Saint Mosgard. In fact, both Otohime and Fisher Tiger desired to abandon the will that they had inherited from their previous generations. Uninherited will is also explored in the case of Sanji and the Germa Kingdom. Almost all of his post-time skip character arc has been a struggle to uninherit the will of his family that keeps relentlessly seeping into his life. And during the raid on Onigashima, that will even briefly threatened to take command of him. So uninherited will is usually quite a positive concept. Think of it as another form of liberation. You don't have to carry on tradition, you can choose your own path forward, etc. However, I do believe that in the case of Blackbeard, whether he has intended to or not, he has uninherited the will of his father Rox, and his current state now much more powerfully resembles Imu and the world nobles, who are of course the ones responsible for his father's death. So having mentioned the liberation, obviously one of the main ideas that Oda really likes to push in One Piece is that their freedom. No matter what arc we're going through and no matter what sub-themes Oda chooses to include in said arc, freedom is always the paramount exploration, with Luffy occupying the position of maximum freedom on one side of the spectrum, and his antagonists tend to exist on the other side, representing maximum restraint, captivity, servitude, and even outright slavery. And this is the side of the spectrum that Blackbeard exists on as well. As a big bad pirate man who generally does what he wants, when he wants, to who he wants, it can be natural to think that Blackbeard, like Luffy, is a figure of freedom, albeit a much more sinister freedom, but he very much is not, which we will get into in a bit. However, Father Xebec very much is a figurehead of freedom. Luffy's definition of the Pirate King is the man who is the most free in the world, whilst Roger, the man who became the Pirate King, was objectively the most free man of that era. And if there was such a thing as a Pirate King during the time of Rox, then it is quite possible that he would have been worthy of that title as well, because he may be the most free man that we have witnessed to date. As the narrator of One Piece has labeled Rox making his way into the Chamber of Flowers as an event that has never occurred before and will never occur again. Xebec, he invaded Mariejois as a one-man force. He did what not even Dragon or Kuma were willing to do when Ginny got captured. And the Chamber of Flowers is probably the single most difficult space to breach on this entire planet. You might think that Laugh Tale is even harder to get to, but more people have set foot on that island than have infiltrated the very core of the world government. The fact that Rox can not only get in but also safely get out is a demonstration of freedom that would have even Luffy salivating. But it's not all about personal freedom. It's about the very concept of liberty, including how Rox and Blackbeard treat those around them. Rox has had the most unique path to captaincy that we've ever witnessed in the series, and he never forced any crew members to join him. Yes, he did win them in Davy backfights, but it was their choice to participate in the games to begin with. And after Rox got his first big handful of crew members, many of the most powerful pirates in the world started to approach him of their own volition, requesting to join without going through any of the games, such as in the case of Silver Axe. So it was freedom that was attracting all of these pirates to Rox. However, in the case of Blackbeard gathering most of his crew, he had a very different philosophy. He clearly wanted to follow in the path of Daddy Rox by gathering many of the world's most notorious pirates some names, but he chose to do so with an impel down. Rox assembled his crew in the fresh air of the open seas, whilst Blackbeard chose the most confined and trapped place on the planet where freedom had been completely stripped of all those who inhabit it. And what Blackbeard offered his potential future crew members were, you can join me or you can remain trapped. And as much as you could say that Blackbeard was offering freedom, he was also threatening the prisoners with continued suppression. And not only that, but he also made it a life or death matter by stating that only the survivors from each cell would be given the opportunity to join his crew. So it wasn't just join me or remain trapped, it was join me or die. So that's not quite freedom, but it still does in a way pay tribute to a twisted idea of freedom because he's breaking them out of jail. I would call it freedom in name rather than in function, because what Teach created was a very sickening battle royale sort of game, which does kind of follow Rox using the Davy back fight to assemble his crew, but in actuality what Blackbeard did was much closer to the sort of entertainment that a world noble would come up with, one that takes advantage of the subjugation of the players. And from everything that we now know about Rocks, and as much as the Marines and the world government will say otherwise, Rocks just didn't have that sheer cruelty within him. And it's quite tragic for Blackbeard to have now grown into a man who more resembles the world nobles, the people who killed his father and caused this trauma, than his father himself. And I'd also like to add that Blackbeard, he didn't even compete in his own contest, whereas Rocks, he was always on the front lines competing as fairly as possible in consensually agreed upon pirate games. Although it should be said that the Rocks pirates did have differing views on freedom to the captain, Mr. Rocks himself, a great example of which is Kaido, who, when the Gallilar giants are brought up as being essential, Kaido's solution to the issue of getting the giants onto his side was, can't you just suppress them with sheer strength? Which was not what Rocks wanted to hear, not at all. Rocks, he had the plan to get these giants to assist him through other means, those other means being King Harold's influences, his best friend. Rocks, despite his absurdly immense power, had no interest in using that raw strength to force anyone to work for him. And this is the complete antithesis of how we've seen Blackbeard operate throughout his entire career. In fact, I reckon that Blackbeard and Kaido would probably get along quite well, because Teach, he's all on board with suppression via strength. Blackbeard doesn't believe in giving people choices if they're an important part of his plan. He just goes out there and he takes people as he needs them, like Ace to spark the Paramount War, or Koby to try and barter for Hachinosu to become a world government kingdom, or Charlotte Pudding because he needs her three-eyed powers to read his poneglyphs. Now contrast that to Rocks trying to recruit Harold. What Rocks said was, I need you on my team, best buddy. You and I, we could take over the world together. Oh, you don't want to? Well, never mind. I wouldn't want to infringe on your free will. Have a good day. And in chapter 1158, when Rocks discovered that Harold was being seduced by the world government, he stated, they'll turn you into slaves and call you soldiers. Where has your warrior's pride gone? What does your own free will say? Freedom is a paramount concern for Rocks. And just to linger on his criticism of the world government here, Blackbeard right here and now is currently trying to join the world government. For a second time, I guess. Blackbeard wants Hachinosu to be officially invited into the world government and for himself to be crowned as a king, which is no doubt just one more step in whatever his grander plan is, and the world government would be foolish to do this after the warlord debacle. But the very fact that Teach is focused on joining the world government at all goes against everything that Rocks stood for. When Rocks found out that Harold was considering this, he had a full-on fight to try and stop him. And now Rocks' son is doing the same thing, just for much, much less noble reasons. Where is your warrior's pride, Blackbeard? Oh, you don't have any. And so Rocks just did not have that ruthlessness about him that persists in Kaido and Big Mom and has been installed into Blackbeard, because if you think about the Aces, Kobe's, Puddings, and Garps, they're not even people to Blackbeard, they're more akin to currency. He needs to use them to buy the next stages of his master plan. And Blackbeard isn't particularly selective with his currency either. Prior to the invasion by sword, Hachinosu was storing an unknown quantity of slaves who Blackbeard was planning to sell, and the keeping and trading of slaves is a big line that Rocks certainly never crossed. And that may not be due to moral reasons like feeling bad about the whole topic of slavery, it's just not a very nice thing to do. It might not even be because of that. It could just be because it goes against the Rocks principle of freedom. Even looking at it very cynically, you could view it like the Straw Hat Grand Fleet pledging themselves to Luffy. Luffy didn't want that because it meant that he was now responsible for all of those people. And Rocks doesn't want that either. He wants people to follow him willingly and who do not require supervision or suppression. Rocks even says to his crew, it's up to you whether or not you want to follow me on the fateful day of our mission. So on the topic of freedom, and quite frankly, every other topic in this video, I would say that Rocks is far more similar to Luffy than he is to Blackbeard. And whatever ambition Blackbeard has to complete his father's work has been heavily warped and twisted into the kind of evil that those few who are privy to history believe that Rocks embodied. But he didn't. He actually didn't. Let's turn away from freedom, though, and talk about friendship. We've already briefly touched on this with the bond between Rocks and Harold, which was one of the most surprising insights into this man. The fact that he had a very real friendship with King Harold of Elbaf. And also, not to be underestimated, was Rocks' bond with his crew, particularly the top three, Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido, who all stuck by his side to face off against Imu. And even though all three of them ended up fleeing the battle, the loyalty to do this in the first place is almost unthinkable from these characters. I mean, maybe not Whitebeard, he's generally a pretty good dude, but to have that kind kind of bond with Big Mom and Kaido makes Rocks a pretty unique captain. Blackbeard, on the other hand, has a pretty poor record when it comes to friendship and doesn't appear to care for the concept whatsoever. In chapter 1059, we saw Teach and a handful of divisions of the Blackbeard pirates invade Amazon Lily to acquire Boa Hancock's Devil Fruit. These divisions were led by Teach himself, but also the Titanic captains Katarina Devon and Vasco Shot. The former wanted to cut Hancock's head off, and the latter wanted to capture her alive and take her back to Hachinosu so that they could become, quote, good friends. Which is certainly not the kind of friendship that I wanted to talk about in this video, and it's about as close to saying the R word as shonen manga is willing to get. However, Hancock's Devil Fruit managed to turn Vasco Shot and Katarina Devon to stone, which was quite the predicament, sort of, for Blackbeard, because if he then killed Hancock as he had planned, it would mean that two of his closest allies would have been frozen in stone forever. And it took Blackbeard almost no time at all to callously decide to kill Hancock anyway, even knowing that it would be ending the lives of his comrades. Also known as the exact opposite of what Luffy did when he visited Amazon Lily, as he was prepared to give up everything just to save Marguerite and the other two. I forget what they're called, Sweet Pea and Aphilandra, I think. And it's quite jarring just how casually prepared Blackbeard was to sacrifice his top crew members. Even some of the most horrible people in One Piece would never consider that. Going back to East Blue, Arlong definitely would not have been so callous with the lives of any of his crew, and even Doflamingo, the Flamingo Man of all people, had solid and real friendships with his crew members. And while he was prepared to sacrifice them in the end, as he did with Monet and Virgo, it greatly pained him to do so. It was seen, rightfully so, as a great tragedy. But Blackbeard just went, lol, I guess you're dead, with a sly face, and even though he didn't end up needing to, the loss of his crew would not have impacted him emotionally at all. Because Blackbeard, he doesn't care. I wouldn't even dare use the word friend to describe the bond with his closer crew members. Maybe not even the word bond, because I honestly don't think there is a single person in this world who Blackbeard would genuinely consider to be a friend. However, what I think is most confronting here was Blackbeard's act of killing Thatch to attain the Yami Yami no Mi. This was the worst betrayal that a pirate could possibly commit, and it was made so much worse due to the family structure of the Whitebeard pirates. But this is also exactly what happened to the Rocks pirates. What Blackbeard did was on the same level as Ochoku killing Don Marlin and abducting Shaki in order to sell her. And I don't think that this is an example of purely coincidental storytelling, as trusted pirates murdering their own crew members to this day has only happened twice in all of One Piece. In one case, it was done to Rocks, and in the other case, it was done by the son of Rocks. So that, to me, is Oda showing us that this father and this son, they're about as ideologically distant as two people can be, and that Rocks was more similar to Whitebeard than he was to his own son. And that, in and of itself, it's a bit of a mind screw, considering that Blackbeard felt nothing towards Whitebeard. He was very eager and prepared to kill the man who adopted him, and the man who was actually quite similar to his own biological father. So what we have here, it's a rare case of double patricide, killing the body of one father and killing the spirit of another. And honestly, we should talk about honesty as well. For all of his faults, Rocks Xebec was refreshingly honest. He never tried to hide his intentions, he just said them straight at your face holes. If it's not a Davy back fight, he doesn't want to waste time playing games, and he says, if you don't trust me, then get lost. And honesty isn't just about what you say, it's also something that can be portrayed in your actions. We were led to believe by Sengoku that Rocks was an innately evil man, but from what we've been shown, his actions had this very unexpected level of honesty and purity to them, such as when we're shown the heist that took place at the hilariously named Embezzle International Charity. And so on paper, what this looks like is that the Rocks pirates were stealing from charity. Absolutely disgusting behavior, etc. But what he actually did was steal from an organization that were running an international grift. They were taking money that they said was going towards feeding hungry children and hoarding it for themselves. So Rocks, he was kind of like a Robin Hood. If Robin Hood stole from the rich and then instead of redistributing it to the poor, kept it for himself. I'm not saying that Rocks was a saint or a Kuma style character, he was certainly not, but his crimes did not target the underprivileged or those who were not already entrenched in the underworld. Rocks had a very clear moral line somewhere, which is a line that within the darkness that is Blackbeard, he cannot see, as shown by Blackbeard blatantly crossing that line to sack Drum Island or destroying Bonaro Island for fun in his fight against Ace. Or as mentioned before, invading Amazon Lily to kill Boa Hancock and take her Devil Fruit, whilst one crew member wanted to behead her and one crew member wanted to Something I will also say about Blackbeard is that this is a philosophy I have in life as well. I think generally, if you want to understand a person, what you do is you look at the 5 people closest to them, because that person is probably an amalgamation of them. And if we look at the closest people to Blackbeard, it says some not so great things about him. And in any case, these are all actions that Rocks would never ever consider. Whereas Blackbeard is more of what we thought Rocks would be. This much more classical Yara pirate, who may as well be the physical manifestation of the word treachery. Whether it's pretending to be a son of Whitebeard or acting as a warlord of the sea, this man is a natural liar. And part of that is likely that he feels he needs to use deception to compensate for the power and even willpower that he lacks. As when you see Blackbeard in combat, that's where we have one of the starkest possible comparisons to his father, because Blackbeard, quite frankly, is often a coward. He doesn't like getting hit because it hurts, and Teach runs away at the very first sign of difficulty. In chapter 1059, Blackbeard, he shat himself when Silver's Rayleigh rocked up, and even though Rayleigh himself thought that Blackbeard could have defeated him, it was Blackbeard's timorous and cowardly nature that led him to retreat just to be safe, which is an act that I just don't ever see Rocks doing. He would relish the challenge to clash with someone at the very top of this world, because it would make him stronger. And after Blackbeard's sneak attack on Whitebeard appeared not to work, Blackbeard, oh mate, he did a very salami thing, and he genuinely begged for his life. He was afraid that he was going to die, and so he pulled out the lie of claiming to be Whitebeard's precious son, which did appear to save his life. But where did this nature come from? Because it's definitely not the inherited will of Rocks, and I guess this could play into Whitebeard's final words for Teach, which were, "The man Roger is waiting for is definitely not you, Teach." And Blackbeard, he's surprised by this, as if he's taken for granted all this time that he has the will and right to fulfill whatever destiny he believes was set up for him. But right now, the man who most inherits the will of Rocks is probably Luffy, perhaps even Loki, but Marshall D. Teach isn't even in the discussion. And so what we have is a clear and perhaps unfortunate case of uninherited will. In chapter 1170, Mr. Scopper Gaban stated that those who have formed a pact with Imu are weak to Conqueror's Haki, which makes perfect sense to me, as those who willingly choose to submit their willpower and freedom to the complete domain of a higher being are of course the natural opposite of those who relentlessly exercise their own will and refuse to bend the knee to anyone. It's thematically brilliant, but it does raise a couple of issues, one of which is that the vast majority of the Straw Hat Pirates are now completely unable to engage with the Holy Knights, the Elder Stars, and of course Imu himself, and it's even more problematic than that, because also in chapter 1170, despite both Shanks and Scopper Gaban being Conqueror's Haki users themselves, not even this duo could overcome a deep-sea covenanted Herald who also happened to possess Conqueror's Haki. So even if you do have it, it is no guarantee of victory depending on the opponent. But what has become glaringly obvious is that Conqueror's Haki is going to be an essential base ability for every player entering this final war. Every top player, that is. And that's not a problem for most of them. However, waiter, take a look at this. You seem to have brought me this lovely Conqueror soup that I ordered, but it appears that a Sanji has gotten into it. Is there any chance that you could remove it and provide me with a new soup? To which the waiter says, "Nah mate, this is exactly what you ordered. The Sanji was intentional." In my opinion, it is only a matter of time before Sanji develops Conqueror's Haki, and I believe that for reasons, most if not all of which I am going to cover in this video, that I am reliably informed that many of you are watching on the toilet. And if so, go ahead, drop a like while you're dropping all of your other stuff. You might as well. In the meantime, this is not a new idea. Sanji gaining this ability has been proposed ever since we discovered that Conqueror's Haki even exists. However, this idea has been rapidly gaining steam ever since chapter 1152, where Scopper Gaban got very upset at Zoro for not even realizing that he was a Conqueror's Haki user. However, there are two key factors that tend to go unnoticed about this scene. The first is when Scopper Gaban stated, "Seems like there's more than one of you with Supreme King Haki," and Oda didn't just show him looking at Zoro. No. Sanji was standing right there next to him. Scopper Gaban chose to address Zoro because his power was more prominently legitimately felt. And Gaban also said that Zoro seemed quite at ease with it. And that ease is due to the fact that using Enma was like turning on a tap that can now never be shut off. Zoro is just permanently leaking Conqueror's Haki all over the place, according to Luffy. So singling out the leaky one is an obvious choice. But just because Gaban addresses the more obvious candidate doesn't mean that Sanji has been ignored here. And this is where the now infamous series of panels pop up, where Sanji directly asks Scopper Gaban if he, Chefman, has Conqueror's Haki or not, and the readers are interrupted by Loki shouting at Haradin, brother stuff. But Sanji does indeed get his answer off screen, and he makes this face, which at the moment is vague enough to read any way you want. This look of a shock could be Sanji getting confirmation and going, wait, do I actually have it? Or it could be a look of more comical frustration that he's being shut down, a sort of, that swordsman. Because it's not that Sanji really wants Conqueror's Haki at this point, it's more that he wants to be superior to Zoro, especially now that he's lost his spot above him in the bounty rankings. So the jokey interpretation of his reaction is very valid. But is that really true? Does Sanji hold no other interest in this ability? Well, chapter 1081 would say that he does. Conqueror's Haki, also known as Haoshoku, Supreme King Haki, and quite commonly Color of Conqueror, which is generally abbreviated online as cock. And what I want you to do, right, I want you to keep this cock in mind as I show you this next image. This is the wonderful color spread that was featured in chapter 1081, a lovely vignette of the Straw Hats taking a circular friendship nap. Everyone except for Sanji, that is, who is using his time to study. And what is this book he's reading? Well, it turns out it is a book all about cocking. Now, the reasonable explanation for this is that he's supposed to be reading a book about cooking, and Oda misspelt the word because his English is not good. And the fork on the front cover would support this hypothesis, but just stick with me on this marvelous cocking journey as we look down at the spine of the book, which contains a crown. Now, this is interesting. I think this is because Oda does know the word king. He uses the English word king in One Piece itself quite a bit, and so I think he's seen that word as part of the word cooking, and he's decided to draw a little crown. And this is where the joke starts to become real for me, because if to Oda the word cooking innately contains the word king, and Sanji's ambitions are to find the old blue to further his journey as a chef, would indicate that he may indeed possess the qualities of a king, at least according to the Oda logic of pursuing cooking. But also, we can go even further here, so much further. Remember that cock I told you about earlier, that abbreviation? Well, one way of reading this book is by breaking up the word cocking into cock and king. That's right, Sanji is the cock king. And so he could be a very natural conqueror, because this form of Haki, it feels well explored, because we've had 600 chapters or so to sit with it and see it used. However, Conqueror's Haki is still so much more underdeveloped than either observation or armament. Conqueror's Haki is being described by Treble and Boba Sandersonia as a sign of someone having the qualities of a king, as well as being chosen by the heavens. And it's hard to know how much stock we can put into either of their words, but assuming that Oda is using these characters to convey information directly to us, then what we need to do is analyze Sanji's potential as a king. And he starts out life with significantly more potential in this realm than any other Straw Hat. In fact, he starts out with more potential than just most characters in general. Sanji was born a prince, and I have no idea how the Germa succession would have played out, but it is not unfeasible to say that Sanji was in line to be the king, and it is a strong possibility that he could have become one. We're going to get back to that thread later, because one of the reasons why I'd argue that Sanji hasn't used any Conqueror's Haki yet is because he has spent his life running away from this kingly quality. And from my anecdotal experience with the One Piece fanbase, Sanji is not traditionally thought of as a leader, I suppose because his crowning characteristics at the moment tend to be heart eyes and nosebleeds, and also because he spends a lot of the series in the leadership shadow cast by Luffy. However, leadership is a role that Sanji naturally gravitates towards whenever the right situation presents itself. Whenever an emergency leader is needed, it tends happens to fall to him, such as this great moment on Sabadi where the Straw Hats, they are in big trouble, literally big, as they're being assaulted by Kuma clones and the rotund physique of Sentomaru, with Luffy stating and not suggesting that he, Zoro, and Sanji should split up. So we're trying to fragment the crew into manageable pods so that everyone can go off and escape. And both Zoro and Sanji are deemed the natural leaders of the other two groups. So that is a pretty high endorsement coming straight from the top, the captain, but the other crew members also frequently flock to Sanji and default to his leadership. A great example of which was on Zou, where the Sanji-led team that escaped from Dressrosa labeled themselves as the Twirly Hat Pirates. And in fact, chapter 810 was even titled The Twirly Hat Pirates Arrive, and I don't know whether this was planned or not, but the cover page for that chapter just so happened to feature the chefs of Baratie reacting to Sanji's new bounty. And the Twirly Hat Pirates, it's a fun gag, obviously playing on Sanji's eyebrows, but the fact that this composition of the crew was given a name, even for comedic purposes, shows without a doubt just how quickly Sanji took control, and how swiftly everyone else put their faith in him as the captain. And it's not just pirates either. Sanji is one of the very rare pirates in One Piece who has actually managed to command Marines, as during Punk Hazard, Sanji fell into the role of leading the G5 Marines in the absence of Smoker and later Tashigi. It's like Sanji doesn't seek leadership, but leadership seeks Sanji, and he is always willing to answer that call. He feels like a very different kind of Conqueror to Luffy and Zoro, who both have their respective goals and personalities that enforce how they use their own versions of Conqueror's Haki, and I do think that Sanji might just have a different brand, a different style, a more unique road to becoming the cock king he was born to be. But it's something that Sanji has been actively trying to stop for most of his life. Sanji's character arc in One Piece, overall, it's been one about overcoming self-doubt. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of Sanji at Baratie. During this arc, Sanji's main conflict wasn't with Gin or Don Krieg or even the Magnificent Pearl. His main conflict wasn't with anyone, actually. Sanji's main conflict was with himself. Sanji felt that he was indebted to Zeph, and Sanji had decided to give his life to realize and maintain Zeph's ambition of opening a restaurant at sea. At this time, Sanji wasn't allowing himself the luxury of pursuing his own ambition because he felt the debt he owed to Zeph was too great. And this is in such stark contrast to Luffy and Zoro, both of whom, even at this early stage, had committed to their grand ambitions, so much so that they were willing to stake their lives on them, and it was their actions on Baratie that partially gave Sanji permission to follow his dream. But this could also be why Luffy and Zoro are a step ahead of Sanji here. Sanji, he got a bit of a late start, and he has faced significantly more personal hurdles throughout his journey than they have. Hurdles that, in the grand scheme of things, he has only just overcome by confronting his nasty family and his history on Whole Cake Island, as well as defeating the sum total of his family's powers in the form of Queen on Wano. Sanji is now more liberated than he has ever been in the series. This is the first time in his life that he has been allowed to purely focus on his own progression, as well as his standard role of protecting the rest of the crew. So I do think that now is the time to unleash the cock. And something that Oda has to have purposely set up is Sanji's similarities to the left wing of the Pirate King, Mountain Eater and Giant Maria Scopper Gaban, who is the self-professed preacher of love, with Luffy taking away any sense of subtlety about this connection and flat out stating, haha, that sounds like what Sanji will be like when he's older. So that's the most popular thing that people linger on with this chapter 1139. However, I would also like to draw your attention to the brief flashback that occurred later on with Roger, Rayleigh, and Scopper Gaban, where they are shown with a very similar dynamic to Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji. Because obviously Roger, Rayleigh, and Scopper Gaban, they were the monster trio of the Roger Pirates. And Gaban and Rayleigh, they even had that little rivalry going on. We haven't seen much of said rivalry. However, it is hinted to have been quite similar to the rivalry between Sanji and Zoro, due to chapter 1151, where an injured Scopper Gaban was receiving treatment from Chopper, and it is then said about Gaban, he and Dark King Rayleigh were known as the wings of the King of the Pirates. I assume he was the third strongest on the crew. And despite his agonizing pain, Scopper Gaban insisted on arguing that he was actually the second strongest, which is exactly what Sanji would have done if someone in world had power-scaled Zoro above him. And also more things. Always more things. We didn't get to explore this a lot due to focusing on Roger's infatuation, but Scopper Gaban was also love-struck by Shaki. And what happened here was quite similar to every time that a woman shows interest in Zoro. Like say Hiyori on Wano simping all over him and making Sanji a very jelly. That was Shaki in a much more sophisticated way throwing herself at Rayleigh, much to Gaban's initial annoyance, which may actually inform us of the exact mechanism by which Sanji's Conqueror's Haki may be brought out. Because some characters need a bit more help than others. Luffy, he was naturally exuding it from the very beginning. However, Zoro needed Enma's brutal sucking mechanism in order to develop active use of his. Although I should say that, this gets tricky, when Zoro first used Conqueror's Haki kind of depends on whether you read the manga or watched the anime. In the manga, it's not until he gets Enma that it starts emerging from him. However, in the anime, it is shown much earlier in episode 889, where Zoro appears to use Conqueror's Haki on Urashima after demanding that he, quote, move his fat ass. And that ass, it did not move, and so Zoro, he did a glare. And I know that this looks very subtle by today's standards. There's no lightning burst or aura or impact frames, but this is how Conqueror's Haki used to be portrayed in the anime and in the manga. It was a simple zoom-in glare, followed by the other character promptly shitting themselves. And in any case, as Elbaf has proceeded, I have become a big fan of what is now becoming very real, the power of love. This is a kind of gag ability that Sanji has been using throughout the series, with one notable example being his confrontation with Eshak, but also his Lady Radar, and his ability to hear the voice of Tashigi on Punk Hazard, some of which are likely an advancement of observation Haki, because in the SBS of Volume 71, it was stated that each of the three monster trio specialize in a particular brand of Haki. Zoro is armament, Luffy is conquerors, and Sanji is the observation specialist, which I think gets a bit forgotten after learning Future Sight because Luffy appears to have eclipsed Sanji, but Future Sight is not the only advancement path of observation. Observation Haki is a very diverse art form, and it can tunnel in on anything that the user deems most important to see, such as Otahime having the most advanced ability to see people's emotions that we have ever come across. I suspect that Sanji is the same in regards to the love in the ladies and the love of the ladies, and hence why he's developed absurd abilities like the Lady Radar. Furthermore, we know that armament Haki functions similarly, with users being able to pursue their chosen paths, such as projection, object imbuement, full body coating in the case of Virgo. So Haki isn't as locked in of a system as it may seem, and the highest quality users always seem to have the freedom to use it to accomplish their individual desires. And because we have yet to really get into Conqueror's Haki, my assumption is that it would be the same. There's just so few proficient users of it that we haven't gotten to go down any of the more unique paths yet. And if Sanji was to develop Conqueror's Haki, he would probably even claim that it was the power of love, because his strength is that emotion. Sanji's character arc through Whole Cake Island and Wano was about him being afraid of losing his emotions and becoming the cold and expensive vending machines of violence that his brothers are. But his mother, his sister, his Luffy, they all believe that Sanji's ability to feel is his greatest strength. So why not continue to pursue that to its natural conclusion? A love-based Conqueror's Haki. And there is no arc more appropriate to showcase this either, because not only does Sanji need to find a way to be useful against the Holy Knights, but one of those Holy Knights happens to be Saint Summers, whose whole character is about love, specifically exploiting love because he doesn't understand it and he believes it to be a core weakness of humanity. I look at him, right, and on paper, Sanji is the exact right guy to take him down, because Sanji is essentially the avatar of love, which almost everyone in Sanji's life has considered a weakness up until now. When I say everyone, I don't just mean people like Summers, but also Judge, Sanji's brothers, but even the Straw Hats at times. They have been very frustrated by Sanji being unable to hit women in the past. So is it finally time for Sanji to harvest the fruits of this skill tree? ready and to tap in to the devastatingly late game build of love manifesting to its fullest potential. Man on the internet, how does Mihawk splitting the sky by himself in East Blue affect the Sky Island trout population? Well, if there are any Sky Islands right above East Blue, then probably negatively. And look, hypothetical trout aside, this may come as a surprise to some of you, but it does appear that the very first character to have committed a sky split in One Piece was Mr. Mihawk. It just happened so early on that you don't remember that it did. This is extremely important because sky splitting is one of the very few actually effective methods of power scaling we have in One Piece. In a world where so much of fight battling is decided by a rock, paper, scissors system of devil fruit interactions, being able to split the sky is the only universal measure we have of a character's power, which was thought to be first demonstrated by Shanks clashing with Whitebeard, and much later on by Big Mom clashing with Kaido, and very shortly after that Luffy clashing with Kaido. There's other examples, and we'll get to them, but first here is something that we may have missed about Mr. Mihawk. In chapter 48, Gin is having a bit of a Mihawk-related PTSD, and in his memory we see the silhouette of Mihawk, as well as the decimated remains of Don Krieg's fleet. But pay close attention to that their sky and that their background, because those there clouds appear to have been well and truly split. Now I should note that this did not happen in the anime. I mean, it happened, but Gin's memory is depicted very differently. All you see is the silhouette of Mihawk and the ships, with the sky very much uncut. But in Toei's defense, they could not have known just how important this action would turn out to be several decades later. Now, does all of the things it is that I just said mean that Mihawk actually split the sky? No, not necessarily, as there is an argument to be made that this is a slicing effect happening in the midground, because there is a foreground slash that looks quite similar to the one that looks like it's in the sky. So there is that. I don't think it's unbelievable though, even if Oda didn't originally intend to portray the scene in this way. Traditionally, we are used to the act of sky splitting requiring two characters, which is another reason why it may seem a bit odd for Mihawk to be doing this, because there is no one on Don Krieg's crew who could have provided the opposing force. However, solo sky splitting is actually becoming increasingly common in One Piece. After activating Gear 5th for the first time, Luffy split the sky all on his own, which I will say isn't very clear in the manga, but it did happen if you follow the chain of events. The anime makes it much more obvious, not ambiguous at all there. And more recently, during the God Valley flashback, a Domi reversied Rocksteady Xebec, repelled both a Roger and a Garp, resulting in another solo sky split because neither Garp nor Roger were contributing any resistance to it. And this is often missed by readers. This was missed by me on the first time around, but a solo sky split happened on Egghead Island as well. After Emmett released Joy Boy's Haki not only did he blow all of those elders back to Old Man Land, but the remnants of Joy Boy's Haki on its own was able to split the sky. Which does leave us in a bit of an odd spot power scaling wise using the sky splitting measure, because up the top we got your Luffy, we got your Rocks, and then I guess around here you've got your Shanks, your Kaidos, your Big Mums, your Whitebeards, who were also able to split the sky, but they needed another person to do it. And then, so we've got them there. Somewhere in the middle, what we have is an inanimate piece of rope, which also managed to split the sky on its own with a little help from a robot. But because the One Piece fan base is the best in the world, the Mihawk sky splitting theory has been thoroughly combined with the existing fraudhawk meme, and in order to keep the meme consistent, there is now an agenda that Mihawk hired Haradas of Weatheria to split the sky for him in East Blue at just the right time. Because Haradas, well, he knows a little something about those special knots that Joy Boy used, the ones that he also taught to Nami. And Haradas, mate, he is also unimaginably tall, which isn't related to anything, but I discovered the horror of this image and I must now inflict it upon all of you as well. Also, thinking about it, Mihawk's sky split did not happen in East Blue. It would have happened in the Grand Line, and then the remnants of the Krieg Pirates retreated to East Blue. So there is that. However, Mihawk is not the only potential fraud that we need to investigate here. Do we know how Crocodile lost his hand? Was it before or after gaining his devil fruit? Could this be his secret? So the short answer is no, we do not know how Crocodile lost his hand, but the long answer is, do we even know for a fact that he did lose his hand? What we do know is that Crocodile's facial scar was given given to him by Whitebeard, and it was actually after Crocodile became a warlord of the sea. Crocodile got offered this lovely government job with wondersome government benefits, including healthcare, which he would sorely need, as his arrogance led him to challenging Whitebeard and getting absolutely wrecked. I mean, just imagine having your face like opened up. It's crazy. Hence the scar. And one way that you could read this is that this incident also cost Crocodile his hand. We have no confirmation on that, it would be pure speculation, but assumedly by this time, given that he was a warlord, you would think that Crocodile would have had his devil fruit, so losing limbs, that's generally not a big deal, as you can just regenerate them if you are a Logia, except in cases of extreme Haki use, like Kuzan. His fight with Sakazuki cost Kuzan his leg, which is gone forever, and he now has to use an icy prosthetic to imitate a leg. And I point that out to say that it is feasible that Whitebeard could have claimed Crocodile's hand, as well as left the facial scar. However, I know that a lot of you will have already paused the video right now, not willing to be waiting to hear the end of it, and you've probably scrolled down to the comments and posted something like, "Man on the internet, Crocodile still has his hand because we saw it." And look, to be fair to you, that is mostly accurate. When chapter 378 was first published, it included a cover page featuring Miss Golden Week's story of freeing the Baroque Works agents, and on it, Crocodile was depicted cuffed, with his golden hook removed, and both of his hands free for all to see. So you would think that that is canon confirmation, and I've just been wasting all of your time until now. And look, the second, it might actually be true, but the first is not, because this was deemed to be an error, and in the volume release, this was redrawn and Crocodile's hook was restored. However, if you do not read the official translation and instead source scans, it is possible that you will encounter this two-handed crocodile, because fan translations tend to use the magazine release chapters, not the volume release chapters. But two hands, mate, that might seem like a pretty ridiculous error to make, but even the One Piece anime has had this issue, as there is a scene in episode 117 where Crocodile lights his cigar dramatically and rather impossibly by using both of his hands, one of which that he allegedly does not have. And this isn't manga, this isn't one dude drawing a drawing, this is anime. This went through multiple stages of approval and no one noticed. But it does make you wonder how Crocodile does actually light his cigars though. It must be a pain. I guess what he does is hold the cigar in the hook and uses the other hand to light them. That's how you light cigars. I don't smoke. So aside from some errors, we have no evidence that Crocodile does have two hands, but we have equally as little evidence that he's actually missing one. And I do think that it would be very on point for a tricksome man like Crocodile to pretend to be maimed, to pretend to only have a hook, and if the right circumstance were to present itself, then what's this? It's a hand! A hand ready to surprise attack his enemies. Because he already does a very similar thing to this, because underneath the hook there's a poison hook, and underneath the poison hook there's a knife. So why not underneath the knife have a hand? It fits very well with the Crocodile's multi-layered scheming, but then the question inevitably would come up, well, if Crocodile had an actual hand, then why did they leave his hook on in Impel Down? And my answer to that is that it is equally as stupid to leave his hook on, even if he is actually missing a hand. It is an incredibly dangerous weapon, and neither scenario makes any sense regardless. Although I did once hear the argument that the hook was left on for the sake of the sea stone handcuffs, because if there was no hook, then the cuffs would just slip off the stump. But I don't know about that, because Eustace Kidd's arm was taken away during his time in the Udon prison, and he was only given one cuff, which appeared to pacify him just fine. So what this comes down to is that this is either a skill issue for the staff of Impel Down, or a skill issue for Eustace Kidd, still being kinda useless with only one arm sea stone cuffed. Although my guess is that this one is entirely on the Impel Down staff, because they also let Buggy into the prison equipped with his muggy balls. And actually, and I know this is so far from where we began, but this Impel Down incompetency, it goes even deeper and potentially even into outright treason, because Crocodile's hook was broken by Luffy during their fight on Alabasta. So not only did Impel Down allow Crocodile to keep whatever remained of his hook, but they actually went out of their way to repair it for him. How very kind of them. I do think it would be a real fun twist though, if Crocodile strategically chose to give himself a bulky shiny hook to make himself look more intimidating, and to give him that one extra layer of deception. Remembering that Crocodile is not a straightforward fighter. He cannot compete at the top with strength alone, and so he needs as many options as possible to keep as his opponents off guard, and perhaps there is a world where it turns out that this anime scene was no error at all, and Crocodile just rocked up on set without his full costume on. Wardrobe malfunction, embarrassing. But having said that about Crocodile, another very interesting thought was brought up recently. I think Crocodile actually has a great matchup against Ryukugyu, Greenbull. What with the sucking all the water out of his enemies thing? That's right, Crocodile loves to suck his enemies things. Every devil fruit in One Piece has a natural counter in some way, shape, or form. And if anyone was to make Greenbull of all people do the NL face, then I think Crocodile stands a pretty good chance. The Forest Logia is actually one of my favorite devil fruits in general. It's just so unique for a Logia, and it allows Oda to draw so many cool nature-based attacks and defenses that we don't even come close to seeing from anyone else. But being unique is not always a good thing. In fact, it's usually pretty bad, especially as a Logia user. Blackbeard, he's pretty unique with his Darkness Logia, so unique that it's not really a Logia, and it has the insane weakness of allowing people to hit Blackbeard's physical body even when its powers are not activated, and on top of that, Blackbeard also incurs increased damage. Wonderful. And Greenbull, he's a bit similar to me. As cool as the Forest Logia is, it is weak against pretty much anything else. Even common fire-based abilities are an issue, which is why the inexperienced Momonosuke was able to deal some good damage to a Marine Admiral. In fact, most elements seem practically designed to destroy forests. Even water, one of the best friends of the plants, because in this case, water is a universal weakness of devil fruit users in general. Although I could see Greenbull maybe having a fun reaction with Kizaru. If Kizaru tried to use any light-related abilities, then perhaps Greenbull could voraciously photosynthesize and become a mega forest or something. But Crocodile may be Greenbull's worst elemental matchup, even worse than fire. However, I still don't see Crocodile winning in a 1v1, just because there is more to Greenbull than simply fruit power. He's an Admiral level Haki user, which means he's probably all over that advanced armament and observation, and something that we still haven't seen yet is that Greenbull is also a swordsman. So there is much more to him than just garden-based activities. However, what I would like to think is that Crocodile could be an invaluable ally to someone else taking on Greenbull at the time. Say if Cross-Guild ever got caught up fighting him, which is possible as Greenbull is the one who defeated and captured Edward Weevil, and should the Cross-Guild trend of replicating Rock's pirates continue, then he would be an amazing addition to fill that Whitebeard-shaped spot, and so Crocodile could completely counter Greenbull's elemental powers, while someone else like Mihawk could deal with the actual, substance of Greenbull. Hi, I wanted to ask you something. Proceed. What do you consider prime age for characters in One Piece? Alright, so this is actually a really good question. I mentioned earlier that one of the only reliable ways to power scale in One Piece was to use the sky-splitting measure, and one of the reasons why that is because the concept of prime is very difficult to define. It's very popular to start a discussion with a sentence like, who would win in a fight battle, Kaido or Prime Garp? And with that, we're already off to a difficult start because nobody really knows when Garp was in his prime or the true extent of what that meant power-wise. So we've got prime referring to the age when they were at their peak power. And I will say that for most One Piece characters, there is a fairly established trend, at least amongst the human characters, as achieving prime power tends to happen in the 40s and 50s, 30s for some very special people like Shanks, who is 39, and can probably be described as being in his prime in the modern day, even without one of his arms. Meanwhile, Goldie Roger died at the age of 53, and that was probably either close to or smack bang on his prime, maybe a little bit after it, but this is especially evident after the God Valley flashback. As Roger, he was still a powerhouse back then, but there were subtle indicators that he still had yet to reach his peak. Like when he clashed with Whitebeard on God Valley, both of their blades were touching, whereas about a decade later when they meet again, both Roger and Whitebeard clash with advanced Haki without their blades touching. But whenever this state is achieved, it does look like it can be sustained or at least not substantively decline into the 60s, as Kaido is 59 years old and Big Mom is 68 years old, and both of them were as powerful as we've ever seen them during the raid on Onigashima. But it's into the 70s where the decline seems to pretty rapidly take place and fighters lose that prime edge. Wizened grey-haired elders such as Garp, Rayleigh, Whitebeard, and Scopper Gaban are all individuals in their 70s who have made comments about their own abilities failing them and that they just aren't what they used to be. With the crazy thing about that particular group being that Whitebeard is the youngest youngest of all of the characters I just mentioned. Whitebeard died at 72 years old, whilst Garp and Rayleigh are both 78 now. So age does have greater effects on some people than others, just like real life, especially because Whitebeard started developing age-related additional health conditions as well. Which makes sense for us, but not necessarily for One Piece humans, because as always we should point out that Oda has said that the average human lifespan in One Piece is about 140 years old. So most characters seem to reach their prime about a third of the way through their lives. However, that does not apply to our main characters, as the Straw Hats are all going to either reach their primes this year, this in-world year, and a lot of them aren't even 20 yet. That, or their true prime 2 to 3 decades from now, is going to be so unfathomably powerful that it makes the people we now call legends like Rox, Roger, and Garp look like an utter joke in comparison. But you do need to consider race as well. Giants, for example, have a lifespan of 300 to 400 years, and so they won't generally reach their prime until the early to mid 100s, which is crazy news for a character like Loki because he is only 63 years old, and so he still has a lot of potential growth to come. And interestingly, Minks age quite differently as well, because Pedro had lived for 32 years, however his body had been aged to 82 after Big Mom took 50 years of his life. And yet that old man was still pretty incredible, definitely doing better than most humans are in their 80s. If the theory is that Shirahoshi is the voice on the Denden Mushi, then maybe Loki is her type. Then Vanderdecken had no chance of even being near her type. So this is fun, and there's a couple of different ways I could see this going. Firstly, this is of course referencing my personal favorite Shirahoshi line, which is when, despite Vanderdecken trying to murder her due to the logic that if he couldn't have her then no one could, Shirahoshi very politely and very hilariously replied that Vanderdecken was just not her type. And this joke happens not just once but twice, and the strongest of jokes are usually told in threes. And in One Piece, jokes they tend to become real and have much larger impacts than we initially suspected. So one way that this could come back would be for Loki to be Shirahoshi's type, whatever that type may be, and it would be amazing if Loki then replied that she wasn't his type, and Shirahoshi then made the Vanderdecken face of blunt rejection, and also making her cry as Shirahoshi often does. They have a lot in common, but they're also such polar opposites in one key way, which is that Loki was raised as a warrior of Elbaf, strength was prioritized above all else, and he is certainly the most powerful giant on Elbaf. Meanwhile, Shirahoshi has grown up completely opposed to violence in any form and extremely fragile, both physically and emotionally, so there's a lot of potential for comedy in this pairing, but also some potential for sweetness as well, as Shirahoshi could not bring herself to leave the Hardshell Tower without an escort of Luffy-level strength, and Loki could easily fulfill that role, allowing Shirahoshi to explore the world under the sun for as long as she wants without any fear at all, in a complete state of freedom. There is a traitor among the 5 Elder Stars. His name is Saint Shepherd Jupiter, godhead of agriculture, a man who Eiichiro Oda often singles out from the group, a man whose thoughts we never get to see, a man who does have hints of being a sun god worshipper, and who may be implied to have been a tragic King Harold-esque figure, with a backstory of thinking that joining the world government was the correct maneuver, before realizing that he was in far, far too deep. So this is not an original theory. Lots of people have made videos and threads about this before, quite notably Mr. Morge, Marvelous Anime, has a video by Muglatan, and there's a ton of Reddit threads, ever so many Reddit threads. My favorite one of which is titled The Traitor Within the Gorosei, and this comes equipped with the disclaimer that this theory isn't based on anything, by the way, just me being stoned. Hence why I haven't covered this until now, because it's only very recently that I've started to think that there could be something to this, and a lot of it has to do with chapter 1168. But it should be said that Mr. Saint Shepherd Jupiter is no stranger to bizarrities within the One Piece fanbase, and he has been the subject of some rather odd speculation over the decades. As we'll explore in depth, he is the quietest and most suspicious of all of the elders. Even now in 2020, whatever year this is, genuinely don't know when this video is going to be posted. Could be 2025, could be 2026. I also don't know when you're watching it. That could be anytime. But Saint Shepherd Jupiter is the only elder that I still struggle to see a clear vision of personality of. It's as if he's being kept deliberately hidden, and that's why back in 2015, it was proposed that, as he was known at the time, blonde Gorosei was either the father or uncle of Straw Hat Cookman Sanji. This was because of Sanji's bounty poster at the time stating only alive instead of dead or alive, and it was therefore theorized that Sanji, he must have some connections pretty high up in that their government to command this unique bounty. And the general idea wasn't wrong, but because Sanji is blonde and blonde Gorosei was blonde, they were relatives confirmed. So that was fun while it lasted, which wasn't long. But the One Piece fan base has never been able to release its rather violent grip on this man's balls, now accusing him of being a filthy rat, which from our point of view would actually make him more of a clean, noble mole, because it would mean that he's on our side. And I promise that there is actually some substance to this idea. Jupiter is a very odd man, to say the least, and to say the most is the rest of this video. However, I do need to point out that whether it's on YouTube, Reddit, or Twitter, every Jupiter traitor theory begins in the exact same place, which is separating Jupiter from the rest of the Elder Stars, his comparative youth. This is always the first point of distinction, that the Elders are all old and grey and or bald, and Jupiter, he's not as old. The general idea is to indicate that he is a more recent addition or a less corrupted and withered soul, but I don't particularly like this idea, simply because you can apply aesthetic segregation in any way to any group of characters. For example, within the Elders, Ethan Baron Venus Jiro, he's the only one who has an Eastern aesthetic. He wields a sword, he doesn't wear a suit, whereas all the others do, and in fact what he does wear is white, and white, well, that is the universal symbol of purity. He is clearly different from the other four, and therefore Oda is singling him out for the purpose of being a traitor. Or Marcus Mars, he's the only Elder Star who never sits down. He's always standing in the room of authority. Why doesn't Marcus get to sit down? Perhaps it's because Marcus is using his standing power as a metaphor of resistance against the command of Imu, because as soon as he plonks his withered posterior onto a comfy chair, he will have fully embraced his own corruption, and therefore Etra Oda is singling Mars out. Always draws him standing so as to draw our attention to him and foreshadowing that Marcus Mars is actively a traitor. Although I should add that the canonical reason why Marcus Mars always stands was given by Oda in the SBS of Volume 109, and it's apparently because he always forgets to do his homework, so he gets punished like a school student would by standing in a hallway. But my point is that you can do this with each and every one of them. St. J. Garcia Saturn. He's the only Elder Star who wears a hat indoors, which is very rude, and therefore he is the traitor. And look, to be fair to indoor hat theory, it did kind of work out. Saint Saturn did betray Imu by keeping Emmett instead of destroying him like he was ordered to, so indoor hat theory confirmed. But the main reason, I really need to emphasize this, the main reason why using Jupiter's aesthetic is a bad idea is because Oda has since retconned Jupiter's color scheme with the cover of Volume 110. He is no longer a luxurious and youthful blonde, and he is now as grey as the ashes of what once was Ohara. And it's just amazing what hair coloring can do, because he now looks just as old as the rest of them. But then again, Oda also forgot to draw his chest scar on this volume cover, so who knows what was going through his mind brain here. But what I do find much more interesting is separating Jupiter in terms of his role and in terms of his beast form. Jupiter can transform into a sandworm, which makes him the only Elder Star whose transformation is not based on a yokai. And furthermore, he is the godhead of agriculture, which is a very working class title compared to the other elders who govern finance, justice, science, and defense. Although I guess Marcus Mars could also be involved in that area as well, because he is the vaguely defined godhead of the environment, whatever that does. But interestingly, what I've yet to see anyone else do is make the connection between Jupiter's role and the attack carried out by the Revolutionary Army. It is thanks to them that Mariejois is currently in a famine, and that is Jupiter's domain. It is his job to make her the food. So if he was a traitor, then perhaps Jupiter could even have assisted the Revolutionary Army in this effort. And that is why the famine on Mariejois right now is as dire as it is. But what I've also seen is Jupiter being equated to Saint Peter, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, who was crucified by Emperor Nero. The connection here being that Peter is in Jupiter's name and Nero is in Saint Emunorona's name. And also Peter was crucified because Nero was blaming Christians for the Great Fire of Rome. So maybe there's something in that there, given that the Holy Land is currently on fire. I don't really know, do with that what you will. Just as with the aesthetic arguments, that one, it's not hugely convincing to me personally. Nothing so far is. However, what does make me think a bit more seriously is what I'm going to call the Mr. Morge free will argument, which was his analysis of Eckert Island, pointing out that it was a whole arc about trying and failing to control free will among groups, such as in chapter 1061, right at the beginning of Egghead Island, Lilith stated, no good. Another failure. Blast it. Why isn't it possible to control the urges of living creatures? And this was in response to the mecha shark attempting to nom the Thousand Sunny. And so Lilith continued with, the only things I ordered the mecha shark to do were recon, report, and bombard. I don't want it to eat anything because no valuables are left behind. An error in the programming, I suppose. This one line sets up the main theme of the entire arc. As we go through, we see that Sentomaru could not be controlled by the Marines, Stussy could not be controlled by Cypherpole, York's desires could not be controlled and so she betrayed the Vegapunks, the Seraphim couldn't even be fully controlled by anyone, no matter how high the command ship was, as S-Snake was powerless against her urges for Luffy. The main man of the arc, Bartholomew Kuma, could not be controlled by Saint Saturn, who attempted to scientifically remove his free will. And speaking of the Elder Stars, they are the gold standard of obedience, and yet not even Saint Saturn himself could be fully controlled by Emu, as he decided to keep Emmet. So the argument here is that this arc was all about showing that you can never eliminate free will no matter how hard you try. And that within all of these groups there is going to be an example of someone who betrays what that group is intended for due to free will. And therefore the Elder Stars are not blindly obedient Emu slaves, they have wills of their own, and as the main antagonists of Egghead Island, it is possible that they will follow in this trend in the same way that one of Vegapunk's trusted satellites betrayed him. And to be fair to this idea, even without the free will argument, the traitor trope is a pretty powerfully established one in One Piece. In pre-time skip, this was mostly betraying the bad guys with your Vivies and your Robins. But post-time skip, it's more so been a betrayal of us with your Conjuros and your Yorks. But also not always, because you do have your Rocinantes here and there. But even if we accept that betrayal within every group is inevitable, why are we singling out Jupiter as opposed to anyone else? Well, one reason is because often Jupiter neither says nor does anything at all. And when he does speak, he very rarely contributes anything of substance. He speaks in very neutral sentences. He is sitting on that fence so hard that it's going up his ass and coming out of his mouth. And as such, he's never quite displayed the penchant for villainy that the other elders have. He's never referred to humans as insects, for example, nor has he taken pleasure in their suffering, at least not that we've seen. And his thoughts on the sun god Nika, this is so interesting. It may even paint him as a sun god believer. We'll get to that, but here's introduction in chapter 233. Jupiter's first line is about the dedication to maintaining balance. He has this very Shanks-esque outlook, as Jupiter appears to be a lot less concerned with total world government domination and more interested in preserving the status quo, including that of his enemies. Meanwhile, in chapter 594, the five Elder Stars are engaged in a heated discussion about how to consolidate their global power following the Paramount War, and Jupiter's suggestion for this was, we should wait for further developments in the New World. The balance of power among pirates will be shifting soon. We must pick the ones that have the greatest influence. So at the time, the other elders, they're freaking out, man, about Blackbeard, Luffy, Dragon, Rayleigh, so much stuff. And then you've got Jupiter over here just going, you guys, how about what we do, right, is nothing. And let's just see how that works out. To be fair to Jupiter, I do think that his suggestion was quite reasonable. It's never a great idea to act on desperation because it leads to bad choices being made. But he can be quite a frustrating character because he says words, but these words, they're so vague that they almost never carry any meaning. Such as in chapter 1086, Saint Shepherd Jupiter says, then we can bring this ancient battle to its conclusion. And this is referencing the war that Vegapunk would later reveal has never ended since the Void Century. But notably, Jupiter only says bring the ancient battle to its conclusion. He does not reveal which side that conclusion should be in favor of. It's just assumed that he's referring to the world government. And he has a tendency to be the single most neglected elder in artwork. Like this panel of the allegedly 5 Elder Stars in chapter 303, featuring 4 old men complaining about Kuzan not obeying orders, whilst Jupiter, he's not there. That happens a fair bit, and it's either that or Oda treats the elders with the complete opposite strategy and chooses only to showcase Jupiter. In chapter 433, when the news of Shanks coming into contact with Whitebeard comes through, we only see Jupiter's reaction, marking the first of what would become a pattern of furrowed brows with a singular drop of sweat running down his face. For a more recent example, in chapter 1125, Vigilant Garling enters the Room of Authority claiming to be the new elder, and once again we have a close-up of Jupiter looking a bit shook with some sweat. And look, if we put on our traitor glasses, which I have prepared for just this occasion, it looks like Jupiter, seeing Garling walk in and take command, knows that his job has just gotten a hell of a lot harder. Oh mates, how am I supposed to do all my betrayings with a man as competent as Garling watching me? Gonna have to take these traitor glasses off. He's gonna notice those. And in fact, even if Jupiter isn't a traitor, that feeling of his job getting harder is almost certainly still accurate, because keeping Garling in check is gonna be a real rough ask. And most recently in chapter 1168, King Harold revealed his idea to abdicate the throne of Elbaf and to pass it on to someone purer to lead the land of giants into a new era of peace. And as tradition goes, the only elder whose reaction we see is Saint Shepherd Jupiter, who gives us his classic triple dot ellipsis and is looking at Harold in a very concerned manner because he knows what's about to happen, and what's about to happen is not something that Harold would have liked. That's putting it rather lightly, but we don't get to see any of the other elders reacting to this. Oda deliberately chooses Jupiter's face to focus on in these quite dire and dramatic moments. And the only time that Jupiter has broken from this trend is when he gets real talkative all of a sudden when he explains Luffy's devil fruit during Wano. Jupiter seems very invested all of a sudden when Topman Walkuri claims that the Nika fruit is a legend even to them now, and Jupiter exclaims in response, "Then why would the world government bother to give that one specific devil fruit another name?" Which he says once again with the trademark single drop of sweat, Jupiter's sole fashion accessory. And weirdly enough, a lot of what we know about Luffy's devil fruit is actually thanks to Jupiter. Zoan fruits contain a will of their own, and this particular fruit has the name of a god. The other name of the Gum Gum fruit is the Zoan type human fruit, mythical type model Nika, possessing a body with the properties of rubber and I wanted to say gum, I'm not going to, and fighting in whatever way he fancies to bring smiles to the faces of the people. The warrior of liberation, also known as Nika, the sun god, awakening brings his rubbery body greater physical strength and freedom. It is said that in all the world, there is no power more ridiculous. And look, bro just said more words in this one chapter than in his entire history in the series preceding it. And nothing that he says is wrong. It's kind of like that meme, the worst person you know just made a great point. It all frames Luffy and his devil fruit quite well. Jupiter isn't saying something like, "Oh, the pesky god claiming to liberate with his stupid fighting style." He's not doing that at all. He's flat out telling the truth of the hope that Nika brings to the world, particularly with his line about bringing smiles to the faces of the people. And you know what? By ordering Guernica to interrupt the fight between Luffy and Kaido, Jupiter is, at the very least, 1/5 responsible for Luffy's awakening. But looking at Jupiter's speech, and again, let's put the glasses back on and assume that he's a traitor, which he may not be, but assuming that he is, this speech makes him out to be quite the Nika believer. And in that case, perhaps Oda's recoloring of volume 110 wasn't just grey correcting for Jupiter's age, but rather showcasing Jupiter becoming his most free and taking on the white form of Nika, at which point we'll learn that his name isn't actually Saint Shepherd Jupiter at all, and is in fact Shepherd D. Jupiter. And of all of the elders, he is the one whose history I want to know the most. Because going back to his Harold reaction, at this point in time, I could see that Jupiter may have been a Harold-like person who thought that aligning with the world government was the correct move, but he just found himself in too deep. It started out shallow and lovely, then it got into the depths, and now he's stuck in the abyss and trying to figure out how to break free. But also, let's look at his actions since then. With Oda's traitor tropes, the traitor is very rarely a standout member of the group. Oda doesn't like to put too much focus on them, assumedly to keep our attention away from them and clocking them, and often he even gives the traitors ridiculous comical quirks to diffuse any suspicion, so as to write them off as joke characters, which can prominently be seen in Kanjuro and York. And on Egghead Island, Jupiter, he doesn't stand out at all. You almost forget he's even there, which is wild because his transformation looks like a giant cock. But Ethan Baron Venustura was the clear MVP of the Egghead incident, immediately disabling all of the Mark III Pacifista, and he also has this look of pure fury on his face in almost every human close-up we receive, and it leads me to believe that Ethan is 100% driven for the cause of Emu. As I believe with Topman Walkuri, who got heavily involved and did a lot of yelling at Luffy, like a lot, and Big Pig's mood could only be described as triggered. Elsewhere, Saint Saturn, he was obviously over-the-top evil for the entire arc, and Marcus Mars, he was the one who found Punk Records and York, and Mars also had that brief discussion with Rob Lucci, where where he said that it may not be possible to save Kaku's life because one does not attempt to step on insects, it simply happens. Which is enough to tell me that Marcus Mars is also on that level of almost comically evil. He believes in and practices the insect philosophy that Saturn did. But Saint Shepherd Jupiter, he doesn't say or show any of what I've just said. Jupiter burrows underground, he tries to eat Luffy, he fails, but then he does successfully eat a building that gets thrown in his mouth, yum. And he puts in a token effort, I suppose, chasing and sucking things for the rest of the arc. But of all of the elders, he's the only one who appeared to be treating Egghead without a sense of this could be the end of the world government as we know it. It really is as if he wasn't even trying. And if there was such a thing as an LVP, then St. Shepherd Jupiter would definitely be getting that award. Now, with all of that said, am I convinced that Jupiter is a traitor? The answer to that is no, not really. Most of the evidence for this idea is a lack of evidence. It's the fact that he keeps his thoughts and feelings less defined than others, and at times outright hidden, as opposed to the other elders who have no issues with speaking their evil mind brains. And so my question here would be, is this deliberate by Oda? Is he keeping Jupiter hidden because we can't know his true motivations yet? Or is this more of a logistical issue? Could it be that 5 Elder Stars in a room is too many to juggle, and that the inevitability of that is that one of them is going to be more narratively neglected than the others? Could be it as well. However, Oda repeatedly singling Jupiter out for these concerned close-ups throughout the series where no other Elder reactions are shown does at least make me think that for better or worse, there is more to this man than we currently know. I have a fear that Rox versus Roger and Garp is going to be replayed in the future, that maybe Teach fails somehow, and then we have Teach versus Luffy and Koby. So I think something along these lines as well. And the God Valley flashback has only made me more confident about this. Because you've got the obvious argument of will. Luffy has inherited the will of the Roger, Koby has inherited the will of Mr. Garp, and Blackbeard, well, he is the biological son of Rox, but he functions more similarly to the Domi reverse version of his father than he does to Rox's actual ideals. So even if Blackbeard doesn't fail, even if what we get is just him, the setup is still undeniably there. And if in the final saga we wish to echo history one last time, then this would be the perfect way to do it, perhaps even on Laugh Tale itself. And I know that a lot of people aren't the biggest fans of this idea because I have proposed it before, long before we even saw the God Valley flashback, and there tends to be a bit of, I guess what we'll call Koby block standing in the way. But I need to stress, do not underestimate Koby, especially after his honesty punch on Hachinosu. Yes, he's been comparatively physically weak all throughout the series up until right about now. However, he has also consistently possessed one of the strongest wills. And what is the one thing that we know about the One Piece? It is that willpower pays off big in the long run. So big that Koby was included in Oda's chapter 1121 spread of the 12 people who have the potential to go so far as to even claim the One Piece itself. But also in regards to Blackbeard, oddly enough, Koby has about as much history with Blackbeard as Luffy does. Luffy has met Blackbeard on 2 occasions, Giant and Impel Down, and I suppose that they were in the same place during Marineford, but Luffy was unconscious. And with all of that, everything we've seen there, we know for sure that Luffy and Blackbeard, they are destined to do some of this. But that rich line of history also exists with Koby and Blackbeard as well. It wasn't shown to us on screen, but Koby and Blackbeard were actually unlikely allies during the Rocky Port incident with Trafalgar Law, and Blackbeard even directly credited Koby as the reason why he was able to defeat Ochoku on Hachinosu. And of course, Blackbeard even went so far as to then go and capture Koby when they encountered one another again on Amazon Lily, which is also what Blackbeard was originally intending to do with Luffy. Capture him and offer him to the world government in exchange for becoming a warlord. So I guess fate was much less on Koby's side, and he did fall victim to the classic Blackbeard kidnapping scheme. And of course, Koby was also present at Marineford, helplessly watching Blackbeard run wild. And you may think, sure, internet man, Koby, he's got some things. But Blackbeard was the main figure who led to the death of Luffy's brother. Koby does not have business with Blackbeard on that scale. Well, I would argue that he does, or at least a major driving force in Koby's life is to prevent another ace situation, as Blackbeard has currently captured Garp, and Koby the hero is no doubt going to do everything he can to save his mentor. And overall, here's my point. Oda has been setting up this dynamic between Koby and Blackbeard. It's not one that we think about very often. In fact, some people may not have even consciously have registered it ever, but it is there. And I do believe that Oda has been doing this with the intention to pay off this growing rivalry, and I would love to see Luffy and Koby teaming up. Although having said that, I can't imagine Koby being there for the very final part of the fight. I think that would have to be your classic Luffy one-on-one. But the God Valley reenactment, it is very much on the table. Imagine if Gear 5th Luffy can just peel off the Abyss seal like a sticker. Something like that is almost exactly what I'm imagining, actually. Because it is a very Luffy-like solution to the problem. Or he could rub it out with an eraser or something equally as tune-coded. Actually, here is my serious pitch. We don't erase the symbol. What we do instead is the very stereotypically cartoon thing of painting over the symbol. And because Luffy isn't an ornate artist, he paints the simplest mark he knows, which would be an X, which also happens to be the symbol of Nakama. So if you wanted to do a crude dummy reversey and turn an enemy into an ally, well then you just go and you paint the symbol of the Nakama on them and bam, there. We do know that Gear 5th Luffy loves his paint, which he used to craft a nice shiny baseball bat on Egghead Island, and also the X mark is currently implied to have meaning far beyond Luffy and the Straw Hat, because our Iron Giant Emmett also had an X on his arm in the exact same place that the Straw Hats would mark themselves 800 to 900 years later, and if this is an intentional symbol of Joy Boy, which could work, he was the first pirate after all, and the crossbones, it is the most basic of all of the pirating symbols. So if it was connected to Joy Boy, then it could be unintentionally super effective against Imu's mark, because you've got your people marked with the sea, but what even is the sea to the Pirate King but a vehicle towards greater freedom? However, Luffy may not be the only person in the world with an easy counter to the Mark of the Abyss. I wonder if Miss Goldenweek's artistic prowess could alter the tattoos. Her art could be similar, but the contracts are the forbidden form of the art. So this is interesting, because when you go back on the series, it turns out that the very first Tommy Reversey and or pact style ability we saw actually came from Miss Goldenweek. And looking back on it, the Black of Betrayal Colors Trap is eerily similar to what happened with King Harold. Imu's influence changed Harold's mind, it warped it, in the same way that Miss Goldenweek was able to influence Luffy's emotions, to the point where he stated that he had no desire to save his crew. He was just gonna stand there and watch them die. A complete and utter betrayal, although it was a lot more easily countered, because the concept was that Luffy would betray whatever his friends wanted him to do, so Vivi yelled at him not to step out of the Black Circle, which of course Luffy needed to betray, and thus he was suddenly free of Miss Goldenweek's influence, for a very brief moment anyway. And Miss Goldenweek is also one of the more frequently misunderstood One Piece characters, because people tend to assume that she's a devil fruit user, and I understand why, but she isn't. And also, the fact that she isn't makes very little sense. Vivi described her as an artist who can accurately recreate the colors of emotions. She uses paint to make refined color images that hypnotize people. Although in the SBS of Volume 23, Oda defined Miss Goldenweek as more of a hypnotist who uses paint to enhance existing color psychology. And that's great. Up until she does the rainbow colored dreams ability, and her paint isn't just influencing emotions anymore, it is conjuring objects and outfits to bring people's dreams to reality. So not only was Miss Goldenweek the original series Imu, she also appears to have been the original series Nika, able to make people's dreams a reality and liberate them via paint. And liberation is also something Miss Goldenweek quite literally did, as she was the one who broke the captured Baroque Works agents out of prison. But back to the bad one, the Black of Betrayal. I have a hypothetical here. If King Harold was to be stuck in Miss Goldenweek's betrayal circle and was subject to the Depths Covenant of Imu, does that mean that Harold is then forced to betray Imu? Could it be that Miss Goldenweek's influence under that very specific circumstance would trump Imu's? These are questions that I do not have the answer to. But in retrospect, Miss Goldenweek was a taste of where Oda ultimately wanted to take One Piece. He created a character whose ability was realizing imagination, and he gave himself permission as an author to push the boundaries of the fictional world that he had already set up. And that right there is probably why she isn't a fruit user. Because if she was a Miss Goldenweek, she would be subject to rules and restrictions, and that's just not very free, is it? Although my personal theory has always been that there's something very special about the paint that she uses. All across the planet Blue Star, there's several instances of natural phenomena that directly and powerfully influence emotion. Like all of the mushrooms that Luffy encountered on Amazon Lily, which made him laugh, they made him angry, and since Luffy actually knew at least what the laughing mushroom was before he ate it, they very likely exist all over the world. So it's a little bit convoluted, but let's say you manage to extract and create paint from these natural emotional resources. Could that be the secret to Miss Goldenweek's colors traps? And what Miss Goldenweek does is she utilizes the paint in the exact right way to exploit the natural emotional effect. That could be it. Killingham is another one I'm interested in seeing if they are a good person behind the Abyss contract. They are the only, quote, bad guy we've seen with white clouds around their transformation and not black. Alright, so to explain this, there are now a whole ton of One Piece characters who don a hagoromo or a tenne, which are these cloud-like adornments around the shoulders that seem to appear specifically when Zoan Devil Fruit users achieve an awakening, or with mythical Devil Fruit models that are treated like deities right out of the box. Like Yamato's Devil Fruit, the Inu Inu no Mi model Okuchi no Makami, which was said by Kaido to be the guardian deity of Wano. And this ability drapes Yamato with these nice white clouds, much like Luffy. However, Oda has very clear visual language with these, and the antagonistic characters on this level are depicted with black clouds, which includes the awakened Rob Lucci, Kaku, as well as all of the 5 Elder Stars, however their abilities came about. At the moment, we don't actually know if it's fruit related. But white is the depiction of good, black is the depiction of bad, standard good and evil fiction. However, there is one confusing exception to this, which is St. Killiam. His role as a world noble, in theory, makes him in contention for being one of the worst people on the planet, and yet his fruit ability gives him these lovely pure white clouds, which we have confirmed because Oda did color them white on the cover of volume 113, which is a primary piece of evidence as to why so many people who talk about fictional pirates online believe that Killingham may actually be redeemed. I know it's hard to see at the moment because he's doing some not amazing stuff with children, but if his mark of the Abyss is temporarily removed, I would be very interested to see the person underneath Imu's influence. I'm sorry, good sir, but it's not Chopper who'll speak with the squirrel Ragnar, it's Zoro who'll speak with the hammer weapon Ragnar. Alright, so this sounds stupid, so very stupid, but also a lot of One Piece is exactly that. Very, very stupid. Recently, I said that I was keen on Chopper having an animal-to-animal chat with Ragnar. They probably speak something of the same language. However, we should also not underestimate Zoro's ability as the weapons whisperer, constantly yapping sweet nothings about his assorted sharp metals and their personalities, their desires, their demands, and all of that combined with Zoro's perception of the breadth of all things, gives him this strange ability to empathize with inanimate objects, to the point where Zoro probably talks more to his swords than he does to the rest of the crew, which have gone through various stages of relationships. In the early days, Zoro was treating his swords more like dependents, such as labeling the Sandaiki Tetsu as a problem child. However, once he received Shusui from Ryuma, that blade was treated as more of an equal and a partnership with Zoro. And then Enma was a step up yet again, as it was a sword that Zoro recognized was above him in the hierarchy, and it was he who had to earn Enma's respect. So I guess what we're saying here is that if Chopper does fail getting through to Ragnar, or if Ragnar needs an emergency partner, then we have a good old Zoro right here. And I know that this would never happen, but I would love to see a situation where Zoro has to wield this hammer instead of his swords. For whatever reason that may be, I don't care, just do it. Because Oda gets very, very creative whenever Zoro can't default to his swords, like showcasing no sword style in Water 7 or the groggy ring in Long Ring Longland. Well, you know what, even that great Logtown filler moment of Zoro using 3 mop style. This is the Zoro that we need to see more of. The criteria for my Ragnar to be wielded is be a woman. So no Elbaf king would have been able to wield your Ragnar either, it seems. What a useless weapon. Man on the internet, do you think Gonko's the reason that Brook is fixated on women's undergarments? Do you think that Oda would go so far as to put in a backstory for Gonko's Gonkos, if you know what I mean? I do know what you mean. And this is a thought that I like to call panty theory. And it is the hypothesis that one of the dumbest and pervious gags in the series is going to have this heartbreaking payoff. The idea being that Gonko may have always been styled in the same way that she is now with no pants. In fact, her name Gonko is a word that means pants from the former Japanese army. So the fact that she doesn't wear any despite that being her name is a gag in and of itself. Like imagine that your name is Pants and your trademark feature is that you never wear any pants. That's what's happening here, Pants. A joke that doesn't come across in the Arabic version of the manga because Gonko is given pants. And look, Oda has a very Oda explanation for this. And I promise that this is leading to a hard hitting point. But as is often the case, we do get a bit bogged down in panty land whenever we directly reference Oda's words. But in an SBS, Oda was asked why Gonko walks around in her panties, and Oda gave a comically indignant answer claiming that no, it's just an extension of her jacket. What are you suggesting? Walking around in panties would clearly make Gonko a pervert, so yes, it's the jacket. And furthermore, how dare you even ask that question? But look, we all know exactly what's happening here because we all know deep down or maybe shallow up exactly what Oda is. Gonko may not be perverted, but he is. And the hard-hitting theory that resulted from this, after establishing Brook's connection to Gonko, is that he has been searching for her. And the way that he's doing so is by asking to see panties. Asking to see a pair of panties that he knows so well because Gonko never wore any Gonko. So every time that he asks a woman to show him their panties, he is looking for a very specific pair of panties. Something to identify Gonko and end his more than half a century quest to find her. And in the process, he's just developed a habit of asking everyone, even if it doesn't look like that's going to be Gonko. Even Big Mom that one time, which is the one time he actually got to see them. But that is panty theory, and it's possible. It's not something I would write off at all. All Oda needs to do is present it in a better way than I just did to all of you, because I'm not a writer, which I believe he is very capable of. So just prepare yourselves for the possibility of that. Harudin might be given that legendary sword for him to rule all giants. Oda purposely mentioned the sword for a purpose. I like it. Purpose for the sake of a purpose. My god, it's almost like a story's being told. But I am a big fan of Harudin inheriting Harold's implied Meito Great Sword. I just don't see an amazing way of getting it out of Jarl's head without it going... What if the Gorosei don't have cock, but rather are using emus? Good lord. We really need to find a new shorthand for color of Conqueror's Haki. Honestly though, it's not the most terrible idea in the world. With the Abyssal Covenant, assumedly you gain perennial youth and access to a yokai form of your own. And we have seen 4 of the 5 original Elder Stars using Conqueror's Haki. Currently the odd one out here is Saint Shepherd Jupiter, who did very little of anything during Eckert Island except for deep throating and building. And it's not impossible for natural conquerors to fall victim to Emu's packs. That's what happened with Harold. However, here is my argument. You form a pact with Emu in order to carry out what? You carry out his will. And so to assist you with that at the highest levels, you could gain access to some of that willpower to carry out the will. So I actually don't mind the idea of these potential faux conquerors. We already know that external Haki can be imbued in objects like swords, or a more better example would actually be Joy Boy's knot. So can we take it a step further and transfer the willpower into living beings? Living beings that desperately need it, because once you're in the Abyssal Covenant, you are an immortal slave and you have well and truly lost access to your own free will. Loki can't be on the crew. He too strong. So a lot of you probably don't remember this because I am old, and many of you are not as old as me. Still getting up there though, let's be honest about life. But this was the exact same thing that was said about Jinbei during Fishman Island, even though Luffy had asked him. It didn't matter. The fan said Jinbei is never going to join because he is too powerful, too world-renowned, and he would disrupt the dynamic of the monster trio, which he did, as Sanji right now has been bumped down to the 4th highest bounty in the crew, and rarely does a trio consist of 4. And in order to accommodate this, there are all sorts of theories that Jinbei was actually going to die, because he did say, yeah, he would join Luffy's crew, but he's too strong to join crew, so something must happen to Fish Uncle. It didn't though. So I'm not convinced using this argument for Loki not joining. I understand that he seems like a pretty big deal, and he quite literally is, but there are much better reasons for him not to become a Straw Hat, and if you want to know what those reasons are, go ahead and click another video in order to feed your fictional pirate addiction. We both know that you want to. Amatsuki Toki is one of a handful of characters we have met who existed during the Void Century. She had a devil fruit ability that allowed her to send anyone or anything into the future, and so it has been proposed that Toki herself, 800 or so years ago, sent the One Piece itself forward in time so that it could not possibly be claimed until what is now referred to as the Promised Day. Which explains why Roger was too early. It also explains why Imu hasn't gone after it, why Momonosuke has yet to open the borders of Wano, why Shanks hasn't cared at all until now, and why Ray Lee suggested that the Straw Hats take some time off and train for exactly 2 years to re-emerge into the world at a very specific time. So this is based on a video originally made by Mr. Morge. There will be a link in the description, but I've heard the Toki One Piece theory before. It's one of the very, and I mean very first things that was suggested when her abilities were revealed, but I've never heard it put quite this well before. But to begin with, as time has gone on in One Piece, it's become quite clear that the basic premise of this world is that all of history has been building towards an event known as the Promised Day. And we've known this for quite some time now, but it's only recently that we've learned that name. And this comes to us courtesy of the Harley text on Elbaf. It is specifically mentioned in the Third World text with the line, "The inconvenient remnants recall the Promised Day," with inconvenient remnants likely referring to anyone who has any idea of the dawn of the world, or their heritage as part of the Will of D. And Toki, the primary subject of this video, is an inconvenient remnant. One of the very most inconvenient, actually, because she came all the way from the Void Century to do her recalling, which is even mentioned in her death prophecy with the line, "And you shall know the brilliance of the dawn." But there's a lot more inconvenient remnants scattered around the world than just Toki. Quite a few, actually, which is what makes them ever so inconvenient. The Sea Kings would be a prime example of that, creatures that also may have been alive during the Void Century, and ones that have spent their time discussing everything that needs to happen in preparation for the Promised Day. Zunesha and Emmett would also fit this description, but it's not just characters who were actually alive at the time. The Roger Pirates made it all the way to Laugh Tale, discovered the truth of the world, and came to the conclusion that they were too early, which is why pre-time skip Silver's Rayleigh told Robin that even if she knew the true history right then and there is still nothing that she could have done about it. And following the Paramount War, Rayleigh suggests that the Straw Hats delay their adventure by a very specific 2 years, enough time for them to train, but also enough for them to emerge just in time for the Promised Day. And Pedro is an inconvenient remnant as well, having inherited the knowledge of the dawn of the world and using that to assist the Straw Hats. As is Momonosuke, he's rather inconvenient, having recently decided not to open the borders of Wano yet after reading about the Promised Day in his father's logbook. However, I think the most notable inconvenience would be Shanks. Shanks told Buggy after Roger's execution that he wasn't interested in going to Laugh Tale for the moment, a move that confounded and deeply hurt young Buggy D. Clown, and this feeling was only recently changed after Wano. Following the events of Wano, Shanks told Ben Beckman that it is time to claim the One Piece, which is curious because Shanks more than likely could have gotten to Laugh Tale at any given point in the last 10 years at least, possibly sooner. However, there was just no point in actually being there before the Promised Day. So instead, Shanks used that time to hinder the efforts of other people reaching Laugh Tale by becoming an emperor, maintaining balance, and forcing the world into something of a stalemate. Buying time, essentially, making sure that no one else would be ready for that very specific moment. The moment when the One Piece magically appears on Laugh Tale after having been sent there from the future by Toki in the past. Alright, let's get into Toki, which is exactly what Kozuki Oden said at one point as well. We first properly meet Toki in chapter 964. She ended up on an island not too far from Wano in the grand scheme of things, and in retrospect, what she encountered there was pretty horrifying and rather symbolic. Remembering that Toki is from 8 centuries ago, and yet she immediately realized what a slavership looks like, which tells us that some pretty dark things were happening immediately following the Void Century War, or perhaps even during, probably during. And after that, Kozuki Oden emerges with one of the slavers mistaking him for an umibozu, which is very interesting, because an umibozu is of course the creature that inspired Imu, and in fact Imu himself may actually be a real umibozu. So Toki travels 800 years into the future to escape from the dire conditions of the past, slavery and Imu, and what she encounters in the future is slavery and what appears to be the same monster that Imu is based on. And with that in mind, it makes a lot of sense that Toki was so surprised that Oden was actually there to help her. Toki's greatest fear has suddenly become her salvation. And that's the sort of thing that I really love about Oda's writing. Almost every part of One Piece hits harder in retrospect, and at the time this was a fun gag, you had the beat up bloated Oden. But now you can see that Oda was teasingly putting these pieces together right in front of us. And not only that, but I suspect that Toki encountered a very familiar figure in Kozuki Oden as well, because she found Oden at the absolute peak of his adventure lust. He'd just left Wano and he was committed to exploring the entire world. He wanted to go anywhere that was not Wano, and this is the same sort of adventure lust that Joy Boy would have possessed as the very first pirate. And Oden also believed in the same basic principles of freedom as Luffy does, and Joy Boy surely did. Such as when Oden's vassal Izo decided to remain with the Whitebeard pirates whilst Oden went off with Roger, he said, "You have that right. You're fully fledged pirates now. We should all be free to choose." So much like Luffy, Oden was equating the concept of piracy directly with the concept of freedom. And so Toki was comforted by this very familiar presence, even this far removed from her original time. And we learn very, very little about Toki personally in this flashback. It's mostly her mission that we focus on. However, there are some odd bits here and there, such as in this panel, where you can see the old era Whitebeard pirate celebrating a solid day's worth of Yarmy pirating. And you've got Oden up on the wooden stage doing a bit of a stomp tromp and wearing a very similar crown to the one that Luffy's been drawn wearing on a couple of occasions actually. That aside, there's an extra little character moment in here, because you can see Toki sitting with Whitey Bay, the only other non-nurse woman allowed on Whitebeard's crew. And it looks like she and Toki were actually very good friends. And I really like this panel because again, we don't get much of Toki, at least not yet. Oda put her into this story but kept her deliberately out of the narrative, if that makes sense, because she's just far too spoiler-riddled to really dive into at this early stage of the series. Early being 900 chapters in, still far too early. And look, the proposal of this video is that Toki may flat out just know what the One Piece is. So examining Toki in too much depth risks spoiling the premise of the last 30 years of storytelling. And in fact, in the end, it's not even Toki who states her purpose in traveling 800 years into the future. It is her husband Oden whilst he's being boiled in a pot. Long, long ago, the ones responsible for closing this nation to the rest of the world were the Kozuki clan. And it was to protect Wano from a great external power. Wano, no, the entire world awaits a figure, and when that figure appears after an 800-year span, this country must be prepared to welcome and work with them. This right here is Toki's mission. And now it is tempting to jump to the pre-conclusion that Toki was actually there on the day that Wano's borders were erected. However, she was not, because prior to meeting Oden 800 years later, she hadn't even set foot on Wano. However, that is where Toki's parents were from. And I imagine that Toki came to the future because the true purpose of building these borders could have been lost over centuries. And so Toki may have been sent as a representative from that time to guide them. And at the end of the Oden flashback, we have a flashback within a flashback of Oden telling Toki to jump forward another 20 years in time, and she will arrive at the day that she had been seeking, which Toki declined to do. However, had Toki not met Kozuki Oden, she may have traveled all the way forward to the promised day. Now, I do quite like this theory that Toki also sent the One Piece into the future. I think it makes sense on a bunch of different narrative levels. The first of which is using the avenue of time. It feels like the only mechanism we know of that would actually be able to keep something from Imu's grasp. And it is further suggested that Imu even knows this has happened, which is why he has not made an active effort to seek out Laugh Tale or the One Piece himself, at least not yet, but probably soon, because Oda has identified Imu as one of the 12 candidates who could claim the One Piece. But I suppose that's because the promised day is almost upon us. And with that, I should address a seemingly obvious counterclaim to this entire idea, which is the thought that Toki's devil fruit, crazy as so it may be, does have some rather strict limitations, one of which being that she can only send people or objects a maximum of 20 years into the future. So this is a mistake I've made myself in the past, and I can't quite pinpoint where this comes from, but no year limit on her power is ever stated. It's just that the interval of 20 years is heavily focused on because Oden was able to identify 20 years in the future as when the promised day will arrive. So it is very possible for Toki to have potentially been on Laugh Tale with Joy Boy and used her abilities to send the One Piece 800 years into the future. But instead, my question, not problem, but question would be, if this theory is accurate and Toki did send the One Piece into the future, then why was she so insistent that Oden go with Roger to Laugh Tale? Not only did Toki threaten Oden with divorce if he didn't go, but she also begged Oden's remaining vassals on Wano to allow him to complete this trip to Laugh Tale. But look, if Toki was responsible for, zapping the One Piece into the future, then surely she would know that Oden and Roger are on their way to find nothing. Well, not exactly nothing. According to Oden, what they found is, and on that day, we learned the entire truth of the world. What the 100-year void is, what the people of the D are, what the ancient weapons are. In the past, Wano was open to the world, and in the face of that vast treasure, which was very real indeed, Roger just laughed. And so did we all. We laughed until tears sprang to our eyes. So firstly, whatever was left there gave Roger the knowledge that he and his crew were the first to find the island in about 800 years. Although Roger says 800 years as if it's an exact amount, however, Oda recently clarified that when he gives big round numbers like this, it's a general approximation. The larger the number is, the less specific it becomes, and that is the argument that I would posit for Toki's powers. If she's sending someone or something a short period of time into the future, then she can be quite exact, let's say anywhere from 1 to 50 years. However, if Toki is sending something several centuries into the future, then it may become far less exact. And my thought here being that Toki, in order to allow the One Piece to escape Imu and the newly formed world government, sent the treasure far enough away, but at the cost of not knowing exactly how far, which is why she may have been traveling through time and stopping at these regular intervals to check to see if this was the right time. And if so, remember everything I just said about Oden reflecting the values of Luffy and Joy Boy, but also apply that to Roger, and the meeting of these two men may have looked like the conclusion of the Harley text prophecy from Toki's point of view. Toki may have thought that the One Piece could already be here in this time, and so that's why she was encouraging Oden and Roger to seek it out, to use it to bring about the dawn of the world if it was here. And while Oden was on the journey to Laugh Tale, Toki spent her time on Wano, making sure that Oden would be very popular with his people upon his return. Toki volunteered her time and effort working with the townsfolk of Kuri, and using that time to tell stories of Oden's adventures. She was making sure that Oden would have the influence required and the support of the citizens to open up the borders at the appointed time, which, if the treasure had appeared by now, would be now. And Oden would have had the role of Momonosuke to open the borders, with Roger likely having the role of Luffy, or at least that's how it would have looked. However, when Oden returned, he gave Toki the news that they were too early, that the promised day would not be for another 20 years. He gave her the exact time frame she needed to see her mission come to completion. However, by this time, Toki was married and had 2 children, so she wasn't just gonna leave them. And also feasibly at this point, Toki just could have lived to the promised day. Toki would have been in her early 50s if she had survived until the modern day, so she settled in, having already found her own personal dawn of the world. And Toki's work was integral. It is what allowed Oden to retain the support of the people, even after ever so many years of naked dancing for Orochi's amusement, to the point where at the moment that Oden died, the crowd surrounding the execution finished his iconic line for him, and Oden could not have inspired this on his own. It was the efforts of Oden and Toki combined, and also a little bit of Shinobu there telling the story during the Hour of Legend, but it's this combination of factors that passed on their will to open the borders of Wano, to make sure that that will survived until the promised day, even if they weren't going to. And other than temporarily suggesting that he would not go to Laugh Tale with Roger, the one time that Toki disapproved of Oden's actions was when he discovered that she had been shot by an arrow. Toki called this wound trivial, which it certainly was not for Odin, who at the time was not looking at the bigger picture here. Odin was looking at his family, perhaps even his country, but Toki was looking at the world. She was looking at the future, and she didn't want Odin jeopardizing the world for the sake of her thigh. Although interestingly enough, Odin also has a wound on almost the exact same spot of his thigh, so what this did was make them a matching couple. And it should also be said that Toki was only one of many different pieces, because if this is correct, then Toki would have been in charge of the element of time. However, it would have been, say, Nefertari Lily who took charge of space by scattering the poneglyphs in order to achieve this, as she is currently suspected to have been a previous user of the Nikyu no Mi, with Bartholomew Kuma inheriting that will and continuing to use its powers to set up events for the promised day without even knowing it. But there is also a little bit of a lingering mystery with Toki, which is that in Odin's final message to her, he requests that she use her time powers for something that we still don't know. Toki very rudely tore up the whole letter before we could hear the request out fully, and that request could be sending Momonosuke and the vassals into the future. That would be the most obvious assumption, but it could also be something else that has yet to be revealed to us. Because if it was as simple as sending Momonosuke into the future, then there's not a whole lot of reason to cut the message short and leave Odin's final request a mystery. But now I suppose we have the biggest mystery of all, which is that as part of this theory, Mr. Morge was forced to make a prediction for what the One Piece actually is. Because the theory, and it is nice and all, but it's all extremely vague and a bit pointless without understanding what we're dealing with and why. And Mr. Morge suggested that we have quite literally seen the One Piece already, and it is the sun in the Elbaf mural, the original Mother Flame, being held by this shadowy emu-like figure. And I don't mind this, because the sun bringing about the dawn of the world, and it makes a lot of sense, at least thematically. And if we take the Elbaf mural as a depiction of the past, then this was a battle to claim the Mother Flame, which had literally fallen into Emu's grasp, and so that Mother Flame was reclaimed and sent into the future. Preparations were then made in the past, knowing exactly when it would reappear, and that is the One Piece. And if the mural is taken as a depiction of the future, which it may be, and also may be both past and future, but if it is future-oriented, then it shows that we have some dark times ahead, as Emu will likely at least briefly claim the power of the Mother Flame, and we'll have to fight to take it back. And look, the only thing I don't love about the Mother Flame being the One Piece idea is that Luffy wouldn't really know what to do with it. Doesn't feel like a treasure worthy of his grand adventure, which is what Oda said it would be. Although in fact, there's a pretty decent chance that Luffy might try and eat it, mistaking the sun for some sort of food, which I believe is exactly what the Hindu deity Hanuman did. Saw the sun, mistook it for delicious fruit, took it and ate of it. And that in and of itself could result in a final form, a proper full-on sun god to bring about the dawn of the world. So look, I don't know if I'm sure about any of this. I think there's a lot of ideas that could fit nicely with a more fleshed out explanation, and I do know that Toki has to have played a much bigger role than we know. I just don't know if that role is transporting the One Piece, but hey, I'm just one man on the internet, and you should all let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. In chapter 1146, a rare nugget of brooksome intrigue was dropped onto the floor by clumsy story chef Eiichiro Oda, to which we eagerly devoured it, like the hungry story piggies we are. And this was Brook mentioning that he knows about the Holy Knight, and that he suspects that Gonko is one of them. Very intriguing, but one nugget, it is rarely a meal, so Oda kindly dropped more of them immediately afterwards for us. In chapter 1149, it is Gonko who has a rather sneaky flashback right before Emu takes over her body, where a Gonko-shaped figure is screaming, "Father!" And we then cut to a young Brook and an even much more younger Gonko, and Brook is telling her that it is his dream to become a pirate. And this was the lore drop of the year, or at least it was supposed to be, because it was very rude of Oda to tease this and then immediately pivot to do seemingly every other flashback in the series before coming back to this one. We saw Loki, Harold Rocks, Roger Shanks, Shaki. Pretty much every One Piece character chose this moment to jump in line right before Brook got his chance. But Brook is in some way connected to the Holy Knights, at the very least through whatever relation he has to Gonko, be that familial or more of a very firmly rooted mentor figure. And the Brook silhouette in this flashback does does make him look very similar to the Holy Knights that we have seen, specifically with the sword, which is not his Shikumizue, but in fact looks much more similar to the blades that Garling, Shanks, Shamrock, and even Saint Summers use. And so the question has naturally been posed, was Brook at one time a Holy Knight? Did he have a Shallows pact with Emu, and did Brook pull a bit of a Shanks by rocking up to the Holy Land looking for a sick tattoo and then bailing? And could this pact have been broken with Brook's death, as there is no longer any skin for any tattoo to remain on? And in Brook's absence, was Gonko perhaps recruited to fill his spot for reasons? Don't know what those are yet. But I would say it's probably not as simple as that, because the One Piece timeline, it throws quite a lot of curveballs at us. And the first thing we need to explore is the perhaps more reasonable possibility that Brook was not a Holy Knight, and what he stated that he used to be during Thriller Bark was the leader of a battle convoy of a certain kingdom. And that does open up a pretty realistic possibility for how Brook knew about the Holy Knights, which would be through the Reverie if Brook accompanied the king of this certain kingdom. And recently we have been given some insight into the Reverie that occurred 56 years ago, and this was one of the more bloody reveries, as this was the event where Rocksteady Xebec killed a Marine Admiral, and it's also where Rox met Harold for the first time, and they began their rather tragic friendship. And given that Brook's story has now been entwined with these Elbaf events, and we saw Gonko all the way through the Rox flashback, what are the odds that this Reverie was also attended by Brook? And in the future, we may see this event from his perspective. Because 56 years ago, Brook may not have been a pirate yet. The first date that we have for the Rumbar Pirates is 52 years ago when they crossed Reverse Mountain and went straight into the Grand Line. They definitely could have formed earlier than that, but this feels about right. If we consider the Straw Hats, they were together for what, like a week before they went to the Grand Line? So the timeline currently works out for Brook to have been at the Reverie 56 years ago. However, we did also see Gonko during this event acting as Emu's attendant in the Chamber of Flowers, which leaves us with some options, one of which is that Gonko had been conscripted into the service of Emu and taken away from Brook. But this idea very much relies on Gonko having been sourced from the Blue Sea. However, she could also be a genuine born and raised world noble from the Man-Maya family, and Brook may have known her from childhood because, I don't know, he served as a Holy Knight. And you could even be looking at a world where his full name is Man-Maya Brook, a man born to serve God and defend the realm against a disgusting piracy, whilst desperately wanting to become a disgusting piracy himself in order to attain that sweet, sweet hit of freedom. But maybe one day Gonko has a whoopsie and lets it slip. The Brook's dream is to become a pirate, which is blasphemy, and he gets severely punished and even exiled for his evil desires. Again though, Gonko herself is the key question mark in a lot of this. As mentioned before, she did appear 56 years ago as Emu's attendant, but also 38 years ago as part of the God Valley incident, where she had recently received the rank of Devoted Blade of God. There is an 18-year gap between when we see her at the Reverie and when we see her on God Valley. And in that time, Gonko has not aged at all, seemingly, which doesn't line up with what we know about the other Holy Knights and even the Elder Stars. Because even those with a deep sea covenant, which in theory Gonko doesn't have at this point, are not granted this perennial youth. They still age like Saint Summers. But again, Gonko didn't even have that by the time of God Valley. In theory, she would have still been on a Shallows covenant. And Arta from the Library of Ohara did some digging and actually stumbled upon Emu's business model with all of the contracts and what they grant, although I will say the price of $5.99 for a deep sea pact is a bit misleading, as it does also involve giving away your free will. So does the Shallows covenant, but only if you're close enough to Emu. But all jokes aside, actually not all jokes, but most, Gonko doesn't fit into this model as we understand it. And as for Brook, I don't know how much I like the Holy Knight theory personally. However, what I do admit is that whether it is coincidental or whether it is not that, Brook does tend to have a wide range of abilities that do mimic those who have access to the Abyss, albeit in a slightly different and roundabout way. Par exemple, thanks to his Devil Fruit, Brook has actually achieved a form of perennial youth. In this skeleton-y body, he is no longer going to age in the same way that most organic beings do, and post-time skip, Brook also appears to have achieved regeneration, because if a part of him gets lopped off, then his soul, it appears and it sticks that part back onto his body. And for anything that he can't fix with soul powers, that apparently can be regenerated with the wonders of milk, which again, that's a joke, but jokes in One Piece, they are real. I keep saying this because they are. But also, ever since Brook first appeared in the series, it has been noted how similar he looks to a Gashadokuro, which is a yokai said to be a combination combination of the unburied remains of those who have fallen in battle, which apart from the combination bit is a description that fits Brook quite well. He was the result of the destruction of the Rumbar pirates in battle, who were all fallen and unburied. And in chapter 933, Brook appears in Wano in the guise of a Gashadokuro to frighten the Oniwabanshu. So apparently Brook even has his own yokai form like the Five Elders. And you know what? One of the Five Elders even turns himself into a skeleton. St. Ethan Baron Venus Joe, he becomes a horsey skeleton. And because he and Brook seem to both classify as undead, they can both command the chills of the underworld, which Ethan used to pacify all the Mark III Pacifistra on Icod Island, although Ethan's transformation is notably a Bakotsu, quite an obscure yokai said to be a horse that burned to death. It usually appears on fire and has very fire-based abilities. So I don't know about all this cold business, but what Ethan seems to attain from his pact with Emu, Brook seems to have inherited from his devil fruit. And eating a devil fruit is kind of like making a pact with the devil in its own way. And Brook's access to the underworld likely does come from the Yomi Yomi no Mi, which is translated in English as the Revive fruit, but it also takes its name from the underworld because the Yomi no Kuni is the Japanese land of the dead, which can also be translated as the world of darkness, and Brook's chill of the underworld ability is even called Yomi no Reki. So there's a fun idea that Brook has no connection to the Holy Knights at all in terms of serving with them, but he has found another way to access the powers that they use via the Abyss. And all of this continues to make Brook a frankly perfect Straw Hat, since each and every crew member is in some way branded as a demon or a monster. Zoro wants to become the king of hell. Sanji's Ifrit Jambra channels Ifrit, a demon in Islamic mythology. Chopper's entire character is about learning to embrace being a monster. Robin can now transform into a fairly literal demon, and so on. There's more. The Straw Hats on paper do not look like your traditional good guys, and it is very easy to see how they as pirates get branded as the villains of this world. But Brook, also admittedly with a lot of help, has been known to travel via strange dark pentagrammic symbol. The Holy Knights, they can set up these fast travel points all over the world to use the Abyss to teleport, but when Brook gets sent to Namakura Island by Bartholomew Kuma, he lands on a pentagram adjacent symbol right on target, and to the cultists surrounding him, it appears as if the symbol conjured Brook from the underworld. And the cultists then even try to form a covenant with Brook himself. And there is a bit of a crack theory that Kuma wasn't intending on sending Brook to Namakura Island, and instead he was drawn there by this symbol. The symbol did summon him, and this is because during Kuma's flashback, we see him traveling to almost every island that he sent the Straw Hats to, with the exception of Brook. And the exception of Luffy's as well. Kuma did not go to Amazon Lily. But you know what we're going to do? We're just going to forget about that fact for the sake of a fun idea, because that is how most One Piece theories on the internet work. And so the theory states that Kuma was intending on sending Brook somewhere else, but he got caught in some sort of abyss, or even flat out abyssal network, and ended up on Namakura Island, right in the center of the Satan summoning symbol. So to recap, Brook, he has perennial youth, he has regeneration, he has a yokai form, he can tap into the same underworld abilities, and has at least on one occasion sort of traveled by pentagram. So whatever the truth does turn out to be, Brook is still coincidentally and hilariously already essentially a holy knight. However, this may surprise many of you, but Brook has already formed a covenant with a different god and not Emu. And to get into this, we should note that exactly how Brook gained his extended powers during the time skip is quite vague. You might not think that, because the anime gives Brook a much more extensive backstory of being in a slump during his world tour performing as Soul King Brook due to the sales of his TD suddenly plummeting. The TD, by the way, is a pair of tone dials used as headphones, which is what we see Gonko using when she's listening to Brook's music on Elbaf. But at the time, mate, these TDs, they were selling awfully, and Brook's concert ticket sales, they were plummeting as well. And the anime goes into this extended montage of Brook's fans being disappointed with his latest music because they could not feel his soul. And so one day Brook fell to his knees and stated that perhaps the god of music doesn't love him anymore, which I think is an extremely notable line in retrospect, because at the time, no, we were not taking any mention of God seriously. This was just Brook doing an exaggeration. But after Luffy's awakening on Wano, and after having read the Harley text and looked at the pretty pictures on the wall, Brook mentioning a music god could be very literal. And Brook then prays to this alleged music god, who appears to answer those prayers by giving Brook the ability to remove his soul from his body. And looking back on it, the way the anime portrays it is almost like Brook is forming a covenant with the music god, just as the Holy Knights and Elder Stars form a covenant covenant with the probably sea god. It's very, very cool. However, the tricky thing about this is that as very, very cool as it is, it doesn't actually happen. Everything that I just said is anime filler. Filler that I think is quite good and actually surpasses what happened in the manga. Because in the manga, we get this page as a full explanation for Brook's abilities, which is just him saying, well, one day I was praying and my soul just left my body. Yo! That's it. That is the full context that the manga gives, which is very lacking. We don't know why he's praying or who he's praying to, but in the manga context, I would actually assume that he was praying for the abilities to look at more panties, given that he implies he spied on women changing in the very next panel. And this is further emphasized when, after beating Zio on Fishman Island, Brook states, and now a haiku. The lands of the dead sends a sharp, blood-freezing gale to flip up all skirts. So in the manga, Brook's abilities, they do seem very panty-driven. Maybe he was praying to the panty god, but the fact that he was seriously praying at all is quite fascinating. We generally don't see a lot of prayer in One Piece, and when we do, it comes from those who believe pretty powerfully in some sort of established god, like the civilians of Skypiea, who were all praying to their god who turned out to be Luffy at the climax of the NL fight. And even in the manga, Brook's abilities are pretty in line with what we've seen from other god powers. In chapter 635, Brook uses an ability that I have no idea why he doesn't invoke more often, but he uses his music to almost cast an illusion over a bunch of new Fishman Pirates fodder, and more accurately, what Brook does is feel and control their souls with his music, convincing them that they're at a fun festival, and in the anime, Brook even guides them through a dance sequence. And you've obviously noticed this by now, but take note that Brook is being framed against the moon in an early example of what we now know is a very classic Nika pose. And the ability itself, it is very Domi-reversey. Brook seems to be able to take command of people at their core. He seems to be able to influence them. He just doesn't use it for anything quite as sinister as Imu does. And also potentially others do as well. The Domi-reversey abilities may not be exclusive to Imu, such as when we saw Garling leading the Domi-reversey Davy clan on God Valley, when Imu did not appear on the island until he took command of Saint Saturn. So Domi-reversey might be part of the suite of abilities granted when you reach a certain level of Covenant, but even Luffy's abilities have this very Brook and Imu-esque control about them, like when he caused Dory and Broggy to dance uncontrollably at the tail end of Egghead Island. To be more precise, it was both Luffy and Bonnie doing a Drums of Liberation duet, which had the same effect as Brook's powers but on a much larger scale. And given that the manga is so vague, I would not put it past Oda to make the anime event of praying to the music god canon, and this may have even been alluded to in Film Red with the Being Taught Musica, who himself is not canon, but in a screening of Film Red in Japan with commentary by Eiichiro Oda, he did state that beings like Taught Musica do exist in the One Piece world. So maybe there is a music god, and maybe Brook prayed to this music god, and this god bestowed Brook with musical powers. Oda has turned anime filler into canon so many times in the past that we've covered in other videos, but I suppose another Brook-specific example would be Nekomamushi. This character was created because of Cho, Brook's voice actor, one day improvising lyrics to a song called Let's Go See Master Nekomamushi that Oda liked so much that he created a character called Nekomamushi just so that Cho could sing the song in the actual series. And this is a very dangerous world that we've stumbled into now, because something I don't think I've ever explored in a Grand Line review video is the very strange dynamic between Eiichiro Oda and Cho. Because Cho may be the one person in this world more mad than Eiichiro Oda. Oda finds Cho extremely amusing and very inspirational. He has had a huge impact on this manga, and in volume 64, Oda interviewed Cho as part of the SBS segment, and Cho started the interview by performing a 45-degree angle, much to Oda's shock and hilarity. At one point, Cho was also asked for health advice, to which he replied, "Sunlight. Whatever the case, Mr. Sun is amazing," which he said more than 10 years before the Sun God was revealed. And of course, there's this. Cho also improvised a song on the spot in the SBS. The title of the song, it was called Panties, with lyrics that go as follows. Panties, panties. Panties don't walk towards you. That's why you have to walk to the panties to look yourself. 1 on day 1, 2 on day 2. When I see 3, I think I'll get a nosebleed. Life is about 1, 2, pantsu. Get all sweaty and cry all night, but let's go see some panties. The panties you showed me made my life all rosy. Raise your legs, shake your butt. Panties, panties, don't let up and show it to me. That's the song, and he then made Oda join in singing it, which I point out because Cho did exactly what Brook does in the actual series. Cho infected Oda with music and took command of this entire segment. He is very much a real-life Brook, and if anything, Brook may even be a watered-down Cho, but even if a music god does come to fruition, Elbaf has made it pretty clear that Brook has formed a covenant with someone else, which we see at one point when Gonko offers Brook the generous opportunity to become her slave and write songs for her for the rest of her life. And Brook's reply to this was, "I'm quite sorry, young lady, but from the day that Captain Straw Hat Luffy bestowed me my second life, I have been dedicated to no one but him." And the way that Brook makes it sound is almost as if he has formed a covenant with Luffy. His dedication to Luffy is on the same level as the Holy Knights and the Elder Stars are dedicated to Imu, but without needing to force his actions. So even if in the craziest of scenarios where Brook was a Holy Knight and had a covenant with Imu, that was all during his first life. And now he has become a devoted blade of Luffy, all as thanks to the man who brought him into the sunlight for the first time in half a century and gave him that second life.